"How about that drink?" said Jason finally. He sat her in the chair and fetched 2 glasses of whiskey. "Feeling better?"
"Calmer. Still frightened, of course. Maybe angry, too."
She drank, closing her eyes.
"Why did you do it, Jason?"
"I'll tell you, because now you have to hear it. You have to understand to protect yourself. But first we have to know what happened to you."
"The newspaper?"
"God knows I'm interested," she said, smiling weakly. "Here." Jason handed her one of the 2 papers. "We'll both read it." The article was a mixture of fact and conjecture. The first part placed Marie at the scene of 3 murders. Police had found the key to her hotel room on the Gizon Quay. Fingerprints on a gun discovered near the scene of 2 other killings were confirmed by the Canadian government as those of Marie Saint-Jacques. It went on to rumors of a multi-million-dollar theft from a confidential account belonging to an American corporation, Treadstone 71, at the Gemeinschaft Bank. They alleged that an American male holding the proper codes transferred millions to a bank in Paris, assigning the new account to specific individuals who withdrew the money and disappeared. The success of the operation was ascribed to penetration of the bank's numerical codes, possible only through sophisticated computer techniques and knowledge of Swiss banking practices. Marie Saint-Jacques was an expert in international banking procedures and skilled computer programmer, and was reported to have been seen in the company of the male suspect. Finally, an official of the bank, Herr Walter Apfel, acknowledged that there was an ongoing investigation into matters pertaining to the American company, but under Swiss law, the bank would make no further comment. To anyone. Marie finished reading and let the paper drop, staring at the wall with a strange, pensive serenity. "Lies," Bourne said. "Smoke you out, they find me. I'm sorry." Marie looked at him.
"The Gemeinschaft, Treadstone 71, Apfel. They're true, and the fact that any of them were mentioned is incredible. Apfel could go to prison for even alluding to such an account, unless he was ordered to by an authority powerful enough to contravene Swiss law. Why were any of them ever made part of the story?"
"I told you. Carlos knows we're together."
"No, Jason. You don't understand the laws in Switzerland. Not even Carlos could cause them to be flouted this way."
She looked through him.
"This isn't one story. It's 2. The second speculation on a banking matter that would never be made public, tacked onto the false one that I'm wanted for killing 3 men. It was added. Someone's trying to send us a message."
Major Gordon Webb dozed in the back of the Army car speeding south on Manhattan's East River Drive, a briefcase attached to his belt by a nylon cord strung through his right sleeve and tunic. At a ring from his watch alarm, he stretched and spoke to the driver. "Sergeant, turn on your scrambler to 1430 megahertz, please. Will the microphone reach back here?" The sergeant flipped switches on the radio panel, twisted the dial, then pulled the microphone from its cradle and passed it over the seat. "Guess so," he concluded. Static erupted from the speaker. "Treadstone, confirm, please." "Treadstone receiving," said Webb. "Go ahead." "Proceed to 14071 East. Keep your vehicle out of the area. Approach on foot." "Understood." Webb snapped the transmission button off and handed the microphone back. "Forget that address, Sergeant." "Gotcha. How about I drop you at Lex and 72nd? "Whatever." About to see Treadstone 71 for himself, Webb knew he should feel a sense of anticipation. He felt only weariness. What the hell had happened? "Here we are, Major." The Major gripped his briefcase and reached for the door handle. "I'll be here between 2300 and 2330 hours, Sergeant." "Yes, sir." The driver turned. "Could you tell me if we're going far later? These trucks use gas like Shermans, so if we are, I'd better fill it." "The airfield in Madison, New Jersey. I have to be there by 0100 hours." 2330's cutting it close, sir." 2300 then. Thanks." Webb headed south to 71st. 4 minutes later, he stood in front of a well-kept brownstone house in a tree-lined street. It was the last place anyone would suspect of housing a highly sensitive intelligence operation, and Webb was one of only a handful of people who knew of its existence. He climbed the steps, aware that his weight on grids embedded in the stone activated cameras, and rang the bell. The decorative ironwork in the door was riveted to a steel plate, the brass knob disguising a hot plate that shot bolts across when the alarms were on. Webb glanced up at the windows, an inch thick, capable of withstanding the impact of .30 caliber shells. The door opened and the Major smiled at a petite, elegant, gray-haired woman with aristocratic features and an air of moneyed gentility.
"How good of you to drop by, Major. Jeremy wrote us that you might. Do come in."
"It's good to see you again, too," replied Webb, stepping in, finishing only when the door was closed. "But I'm not sure where we met before." The woman laughed.
"It's for the benefit of the neighbors who might be strolling by."
She took his elbow as they walked down a long hallway to a mahogany door, bas-relief and ironwork part of its design, and its security, and pressed a bell.
"Your friends here, gentlemen."
The door opened, revealing the erect figure of David Abbott. "Glad to see you, Major," said the monk. Webb shook hands. Another elderly, imposing man came up beside Abbott. "A friend of Jeremy's, no doubt," he said, his deep voice edged with humor. "Come along, Margaret." He turned to Abbott. "You'll let me know when you're leaving, David?" "Usual time," replied the monk. "I'll show these two how to ring you." The imposing man and the gray-haired woman exchanged warm words with Abbott and left, closing the door behind them. Webb stood for a moment, smiling. The pair belonged in the brownstone, all of a piece with the street. "You've known them a long time?" "A lifetime," replied Abbott. "He was a yachtsman we put to good use for operations in Yugoslavia. And don't let Meg's graciousness fool you. She was one of Intrepid's girls. I want you to meet Elliot Stevens. I don't think I have to tell you who he is." Only then did Webb realize there was a third man in the room, standing at the far end, and recognize him instantly. "Nice to know you, Webb," said Stevens, senior aide to the President of the United States. Hand extended. Webb shook it and carried his briefcase to a long table, unclipping the cord from his belt. He freed the briefcase and opened it, looking around the elegant library. "So, this is Treadstone 71. It isn't how I pictured it." "Pull the curtains, Elliot," Abbott said. When it was done, he crossed to a bookcase, opened the cabinet beneath it, and reached in. There was a quiet whir. The bookcase came out of the wall and slowly revolved. On the other side was one of the most sophisticated electronic consoles Gordon Webb had seen, the miniaturized equal of most well-structured intelligence stations. "Is this more what you had in mind?" asked the monk. He reached inside the cabinet. The console was replaced by bookshelves again. He repeated the performance with the adjacent bookcase, which gave place to 3 tall filing cabinets. The monk took out a key and opened a file drawer. "I'm not just showing off, Gordon. When we're finished, I want you to look through these." "What for?" "We'll get to it. First, I want to hear about Zurich." "I can confirm Carlos has bought his way into Washington," said Webb, taking his briefcase to an armchair, sifting folders and extracting several sheets. "He found the fiche and altered it, through a man named Koenig, who until 3 days ago was in charge of primary verifications at the Gemeinschaft." "Where is he now?" asked Abbott. "Dead. A freak accident, on a road he traveled every day of his life." The monk frowned. "And the newspapers?" "I think this is where the Oval Office comes in," said Elliot Stevens. "I assume you're referring to the Canadian woman." "Not really. That story was already out," said Webb. "We enlarged on it, tied her to another about a theft from the Gemeinschaft." Back up," said the White House aide. "I have to get this clear." "Let me explain," broke in Abbott. Elliot's here on orders from the president. It's the killing at Ottawa Airport. It's a mess, said Stevens bluntly. The Prime Minister is one angry Canadian. He turned to Webb. Let me have it again. Exactly what part did we play regarding this Canadian woman? Initially, none. Someone high up in the Zurich police is on Carlos's payroll. They faked evidence linking her to the killings to flush out Bourne. He and the woman are together. Bourne being this assassin who calls himself Kane, correct? And what did you do? Persuaded the bank to confirm that the woman might be tied in with a massive theft, said Webb. It wasn't easy, but it was their man who'd been bribed. They wanted a lid on it. Then I called the papers and referred them to Apfel. Mysterious woman, murder, millions stolen. They leapt at it. For Christ's sake, shouted Stevens. You used an employee of an allied government for a U.S. intelligence strategy? Are you out of your minds? By tying the St. Jack woman into the supposed theft, we're telling Bourne to surface. He knows it's false, Webb explained. The monk raised his hand. Before we go into that, let's go back to another question, he said. How did Carlos's man find the fiche that identified Bourne as Kane? Medusa, Webb said reluctantly. Stevens' expression conveyed that he knew about Medusa. The records are buried, he said. Correction, intruded Abbott. There's an original and 2 copies in vaults at the Pentagon, the CIA, and the NSC. Access is limited to a very select group. Someone gave them to Carlos. Jason Bourne, said Abbott, getting to his feet and walking slowly towards the drawn curtains, is an American intelligence officer. There is no Kane. He's a lure, a trap for Carlos. Or was. The brief silence was broken by the White House man. I think you'd better explain. The president has to know. I suppose so, mused Abbott. Very well. If you recall, prior to D-Day, British intelligence floated a corpse into the coast of Portugal, knowing that any documents on it would find their way to the German embassy. They salted it with letters containing allusions that pointed to the invasion taking place 100 miles and 6 weeks away from Normandy in June. Berlin bought the story and shifted a large part of their defenses. Thousands of lives were saved. 3 years ago, we tried a variation. A living man, seemingly everywhere at once, outdoing Carlos at every turn. Reliable sources were fed his name. Embassies and intelligence networks were funneled reports on his rapidly expanding activities. People met him, always looking different, speaking in any of several languages about things only a professional killer would talk about. Kane existed. Then he moved to Europe, Carlos's backyard, trying to force him out in the open. He spent nearly 3 years living the most dangerous sort of life a man can live. I don't think there's any way a nation can repay a man like Bourne. The monk paused, then added, If it is Bourne. What? Stevens asked. I'm afraid I've held this to the end. It's why there can be absolutely no interference that might expose the strategy. Carlos has built up an army devoted to him. If Bourne is exposed, that army will spread out and kill him. I understand that, said the aide impatiently, but you said he may not be Bourne. It was Bourne at the bank. The signatures were authentic. But is it now? Continued the old man. If it isn't, or if he's turned, it could explain the killing at Ottawa. The woman's expertise was used to withdraw the money in Paris. Were you able to get word to her? Asked Webb. Mac Hawkins briefed a colleague of hers to instruct her to return to Canada immediately. She hung up on him. If we could have got her back, we might have learned so much. Why is she with them? He with her? Nothing makes sense. Less so to me, said Stevens, bewilderment turning to anger. If you want the president's cooperation, you'd better be clearer. 6 months ago, Bourne disappeared, Abbott said. He was on his way to Marseille. Later, we realized he'd learned about Carlos's contract on Leland and tried to stop it. Then, nothing. 6 months vacuum, and now an explosion of incomprehensible activity. The account penetrated, men killed, and traps set. But for whom? By whom? In the limousine, parked diagonally across from the brownstone house, Alfred Gillette of the NSC said, "How gratifying to be there when arrogance collapses. How much more so to be the instrument." "You really dislike him, don't you?" said his companion in the back seat, a heavy-shouldered man with a Slavic accent. "He stands for everything I hate. The right schools, houses in Georgetown, quiet meetings at their clubs. The superior, self-inflated gentry of Washington, rising on other men's intellects." "You exaggerate," said the European, his eyes on the brownstone. "You haven't done badly." Gillette scowled. "Only because I'm indispensable to people like Abbott. They don't like to spend hours poring over files. They'd rather be dining at Sans Souci or preening in front of Senate committees." "Don't underestimate the monk. Carlos doesn't." The European shifted his gaze to Gillette. "It shouldn't be long now. Abbott always catches the midnight shuttle. Remember, the facts must be presented as if obtained by your own sources. You're appalled. The entire intelligence community has been duped." "It has," exclaimed Gillette. "It is appalling." "Good." Headlights bounced through the glass. "Abbott's taxi's here." The European flipped a switch beneath the armrest. "I'll be in my car across the street, listening." He turned to the uniformed chauffeur. "You know what to do." The chauffeur nodded. Both men got out of the car. The European went to cancel the approaching cab, while the chauffeur crossed the street and hid in the shadows of a staircase 2 doors away from Treadstone 71, out of camera range. 30 seconds later, light spilled from the door of the brownstone as Abbott came out, looking for his cab. A quick interception, a rapid discussion, and a bewildered David Abbott climbed into the limousine, the chauffeur vanishing into the shadows. "You," said the monk, anger and disgust in his voice. "You gave Carlos the Medusa records." "What? I'm here about what you've done. We sent our own man to Zurich. His name's Bourne, isn't it? Kane, the man you invented. You've manipulated the entire intelligence community, and as a member of the Security Council, I resent it deeply." Abbott was silent for a moment. "What put you onto it?" "You," said Gillette. "I must say I admired your control when Manning spoke so knowingly about Medusa in front of the man who created it. But it got me thinking. So I objected to the attention being paid to Kane, and you threw Carlos into the hunt." "It was true," protested Abbott. "Sure, and ingenious. Who better to relay the moves we made against him than the one man who gets reports on every covert operation? You used us all." The monk nodded. "To a point, you're right. But there are checks and balances. Treadstone consists of the trustiest men in the government. Were there any real abuse, not one of them that would hesitate to stop the operation. No one has ever seen fit to do so, and I beg you not to either." "I'd be made part of Treadstone?" "You are now." "So what happened? Where's Bourne?" "I wish we knew. We're not even sure it is Bourne." The European snapped off the switch on the dashboard. "That's what we had to know." He turned to the chauffeur. "Go. Remember, if one of them comes out, you have just 3 seconds before the door closes." The uniformed man got out and walked towards Treadstone 71. The European withdrew a silenced revolver and crossed to the limousine, staying in the blind spot until he lunged for the right front door and spun inside, leveling his weapon over the seat. Gillette gasped, reaching for the door handle as he snapped the central locking. Abbott stared at the invader, immobile. "What? Who are you?" cried Gillette, feigning ignorance. "Oh, come," said the man with the gun. "I can see by Mr. Abbott's face that he realizes his doubts about you were right. He did give us Medusa, monk, and he did lead us to Bourne." "You!" Gillette rose, his face contorted. The European fired, and he crumpled against the door, owl eyes wide. "I don't think you mourn him," said the gunman. "I don't," said the monk. "You'll learn nothing from me. Don't try. We know it. All that remains is to remove the man who makes the decisions. You. There are others. Bourne will reach them. They'll kill him on sight, once they know he was yours to begin with. There's nothing more despicable than a turncoat. Carlos has proof." The old man frowned. "There is none," he said. "You believed so because the circumstances of Bourne's disappearance has been obliterated from your records. You didn't consider Hanoi's. On 25th March 1968, Jason Bourne was executed by an American intelligence officer in Tam Quan." The monk lunged forward in a final gesture of defiance. The European fired. The door of the brownstone opened. Beneath the staircase, the chauffeur smiled. The White House aide was being escorted out by the yachtsman, which meant the primary alarms were off. He pulled the trigger twice. The yachtsman fell back inside. Stevens clutched his chest, reeling into the door frame. The chauffeur raced up the steps, catching his body, hurling it into the foyer. Along the lintel of the steel-plated door ran a thick cable. He closed the door part way and fired into it, disabling the cameras in an eruption of sparks. He opened the door again. The European was already crossing the street. Together they lifted a rug and closed the door on its edge so that a 2-inch gap remained, meaning no backup alarms could be raised. An upstairs door opened. There were footsteps and a cultured female voice.
"Darling, I just noticed the camera's on the fritz. Would you check it, please?"
There was a pause. Then the woman spoke again.
"On second thoughts, don't bother, darling. I'll tell David."
2 footsteps. Silence. A rustle of cloth. A light in the stairwell went out. David. Monk. "Get her!" the European roared. The chauffeur raced up the staircase. There was a shot from a powerful weapon, unsilenced. The European looked up. The chauffeur was holding his shoulder, his coat drenched with blood, his pistol spitting repeatedly up the stairs. The door at the end of the hallway was yanked open, the major standing there in shock, a folder in his hand. The European fired twice, sending Gordon Webb arching backwards, papers flying, then raced up to the chauffeur. Above, hanging over the banister, was the gray-haired woman, blood spilling out of her neck. "Are you all right? Can you move?" he asked. The chauffeur nodded. "The bitch blew half my shoulder off, but I can manage." "You have to," commanded his superior, ripping off his raincoat. "Put this on. I need the monk in here, quickly. Then drive Gillette out to the swamps and get yourself seen to." The wounded man put on the coat and made his awkward way downstairs, out of the door and down the steps. The European watched, making sure he was equal to the task, knowing in his heart that he was. Carlos's men were capable of such things. The exposed files in the library were a gift beyond belief, containing every code and method of communication ever used by the mythical Kane. The European quickly gathered them and set the scene. Abbott and Stevens in chairs, the yachtsman slumped over a table, an overturned whiskey bottle under his hand, while Gordon Webb sprawled on the floor, clutching his briefcase. The European walked around in suede gloves, appraising his artistry. He had wiped every door, every knob, every gleaming surface. It was time for the final touch. He picked up a brandy glass and held it to the light. As he expected, it was spotless. From a flat plastic case, he removed a strip of transparent tape, holding it, too, up to the light. There they were, taken off a glass of Perrier from an office at the Gemeinschaft Bank. The fingerprints of Jason Bourne's right hand. The European pressed the tape around the brandy glass, then gently peeled it off. Again he held the glass up. The prints were seen in dull perfection. He dropped the glass on the parquet floor, knelt down to study the fragments, removed several, and brushed the rest under the edge of a curtain. Marie had read the newspaper article again, more and more confident of her analysis.
"I'm right, Jason. Someone is sending us a message."
"Later. That newspaper will be all over this hotel in an hour, and you stand out in a hotel lobby. Get your things."
"We'll talk about several things later,"
she said firmly. "I told you I'd explain, and I meant it. But right now, get your things, goddammit." Marie walked straight through the lobby to the street, as instructed, while Jason paid the bill. They found a cab 5 blocks away, and Bourne, playing the American tourist, explained that he and his belle amie wanted to get out of Paris for a day or so, to be alone. Perhaps the driver could suggest somewhere. "Oh, there's an inn outside Les Molyneux Billancourt, Maison Quadriage," he said. "Or the Auberge du Coin in Montrouge is also discreet." "Let's try the first," said Jason. He turned to Marie and murmured, "Change your hair. Pull it up or push it back, out of sight of his mirror. Hurry." Moments later, Marie's long auburn hair was pulled into a tight chignon. Jason looked at her in the dim light. "Wipe off your lipstick. Have you got an eyebrow pencil?"
Of course.
"Thicken your eyebrows a little and curve the ends down a touch." She obeyed.
All right?
She asked. The changes were minor, but she'd been transformed into a harsher image, not on first sight the woman in the newspaper photograph. Several late diners were emerging as they arrived at the inn. Bourne leaned forward. "Let us off in the car park, if you don't mind," he ordered. "Bien, monsieur," said the driver, shrugging, conveying his opinion that his passengers were certainly discreet. Bourne and Marie remained in the shadows until cab and revelers had disappeared. Then Jason put down the suitcases. "Wait here," he said. "I'm going to phone for a taxi." The second taxi driver took them to Montrouge, unimpressed by the provincial, stern-faced couple. The Auberge du Coin was a 2-story structure off the main road, reminiscent of motels the world over. They registered erroneously and were given a room where every accessory worth over 20 francs was bolted to the floor or screwed to formica. "Now, who would be sending us a message?" asked Bourne.
If I knew, I'd get in touch with them,
Marie said.
A man like Apfel didn't do what he did to accommodate a trap.
Bourne sat in a single plastic armchair. "Koenig did."
He was a bribed foot soldier. Apfel's statement was made in the bank's name. It had to be cleared by his superiors. And he said that they would have no further comment. We're to contact someone else. The Zurich police will expect me to get in touch with the embassy.
Marie stopped.
Jason, that's it. I didn't think of it because I'd already spoken to the embassy, to Corbelier. But that was yesterday, not tonight.
She started for the phone. Bourne intercepted her. "Don't," he said. "You're wrong. I think you'd better listen to what I have to say."
"No," she cried. "I don't want to hear it. An hour ago you'd made up your mind to run, without me, and I know that'll happen again and again, because you'll always condemn yourself until someone proves to you that someone's using you. But there's also someone out there who wants to help. Let me prove it."
Bourne looked at her lovely face, filled with pain and hope. Perhaps it was better this way. She would see for herself there was nothing for them any longer. "All right, make the call. But it's got to be done my way." He released her and dialed the front desk. "This is room 341. Some friends in Paris are coming out to join us. Do you have a room for them?" "Briggs, an American couple." "If I come down and pay, can you let me have the key?" "Thank you."
"What are you doing?"
asked Marie. "Proving something to you," he said. "Get me a dress, the longest you've got," he continued, taking trousers and a shirt from his suitcase. 15 minutes later, the Briggs' room was ready. "You can make the call now," said Jason. "Just say what I told you." She dialed. It was 1:15 in the morning, but 7 seconds after she reached the embassy switchboard, Denis Corbelier was on the line.
"Christ almighty, where are you? I've been waiting here since 5 this afternoon."
"Someone told you to wait, didn't they? What did they say?"
"That you need our help."
"And they want to help us?"
"You're saying he's with you?"
Bourne, his face next to hers, head angled to hear Corbelier's words, nodded.
"Yes,"
she answered.
"But he's out for a few minutes. It's all lies. They told you that, didn't they?"
"All they said was that you had to be protected. They want to send a car for you. Their orders came from Ottawa."
Corbelier paused, obviously exasperated.
"Jesus Christ, Marie, where are you?"
Bourne nodded again.
"The Auberge du Coin in Montrouge, under the name of Briggs."
"I'll get that car to you right away."
"No,"
protested Marie, watching Jason.
"in the morning. He was trapped into doing something, and he's frightened. If he knew I'd called you, he'd be running now. Give me a few more hours.
All right. First thing in the morning. 6 o'clock?
said Corbelier.
Marie, they want to help.
I know. Good night.
She hung up. Now we wait, Bourne said. At 3 minutes past 2, the lights in the motel corridor went out. In their darkened room, Bourne, pistol in hand, was watching through a crack between door and jamb, Marie peering over his shoulder. 2 sets of shoes cautiously climbed the staircase, and 2 men emerged out of its dim light. The blonde they had sent up to Bourne's room in the Steppdeckstrasse, and a shorter, more compact man moving fluidly. His coat collar was up, and a hat shaded his face, but Bourne saw something familiar about the figure. The walk, the way he carried his head. The pair approached the room reserved in the name of Briggs. The blond man held his light on the numbers, then swept the beam down to the lock. The stocky man held a ring of keys under the light, selecting one. In his other hand was a heavy-caliber automatic, not unlike a World War II Luger. He turned the key silently, and the men slid in. There were 2 beats of silence, then spits and flashes, thrashing and collision. A light was snapped on, then crashed to the floor with a cry of frenzy. The killers rushed out, looking wildly for a trap, and raced downstairs. A door opened and a guest peered out, shrugged, and went back into his room. Silence returned. Marie, her head pressed into Bourne's chest, was sobbing in disbelief. He waited until deep breaths replaced the sobs, then led her to the room that was his ultimate proof, and found an unbroken light. Strung across the bathroom door was Marie's dress, riddled with bullet holes. Bourne's shirt and trousers had been tacked to the frame of the open window. His shirt was punctured by a diagonal line of bullet holes, the breeze fluttering the fabric. Marie studied the scene unbelievingly, then span around, eyes glittering.
Call the embassy. Ask for Corbelier. Quickly, for God's sake. If I mean anything to you, do it.
Bourne could not deny her. What's the number, he asked, shepherding her back to their own room and going to the telephone. When the switchboard finally answered, the operator was panicky, at moments incomprehensible. Within seconds, he learned why. Denis Corbelier had walked down the steps of the embassy at 1:40 in the morning and been shot in the throat. The 4 remaining members of Treadstone 71 arrived separately at the Hilton Hotel on 16th Street in Washington, D.C. 2 were public faces, an aging senator from Colorado and Brigadier General Irwin Arthur Crawford, freely translated as Iron Ass, spokesman for Army Intelligence and defender of the G2 databanks. The other 2 men were virtually unknown outside their own operations, a naval officer attached to information control and a CIA veteran called Alexander Conklin, a coiled spring of anger who walked with a cane. His foot had been blown off in Southeast Asia. He'd been with Medusa at the time. It was an ordinary double bedroom with twin beds, a couch, 2 armchairs, and a coffee table. The senator sat at one end of the couch, the naval officer at the other. Conklin lowered himself into an armchair, while General Crawford remained standing. "I've reached the president," said the senator, clearly underslept. "We're meeting tonight. Now, tell me everything you can, all of you. What in the name of God happened?" "Major Webb was to meet his car at 2300 hours on the corner of Lexington and 72nd Street, said Crawford. By 23:30, the driver became alarmed. He remembered the address, mainly because he'd been told not to, drove round and found the scene you know about. He had the presence of mind to call the Pentagon, specified my scrambler frequency, and didn't say another word until he got me on the phone." "That man deserves a quiet promotion," said the naval officer. Put him in the War College, Irwin," said Conklin grimly. "He's brighter than most of the clowns there. I called a bureau print team in Manhattan, told them to sweep the place and give what they found only to me. They came up with the one set of prints we didn't expect." "Deltas," said the senator. "Yes," concurred the naval officer. "The room had been wiped clean, except a few fragments of a broken glass under the hem of a curtain. The prints were on those." The senator shook his head. "It's unbelievable. Why?"
Delta was never my choice, said Crawford. I'm not denying his abilities, but I said at the time we should have found a more balanced candidate. His behavior in Medusa was often right on the edge. I think he finally snapped. The CIA man nodded. That's the crux of it, isn't it? He was never the same after Phnom Penh. That's why he went into Medusa, was willing to become Kane. The senator leaned forward. What was? The president'll want to know everything. His wife and 2 children were killed, strafed by stray aircraft. Nobody knew which sides. He hated that war, and everybody in it. Conklin paused, looking at the brigadier. I think you're right, General. I think the dam burst and the hate took over. He's not Delta anymore. He's become Kane. We may never know why, but there's no question we've become the enemy, said the naval officer. Delta's turned. We know what to do. Kill him, finished Conklin simply. You don't bring in a man like Delta, and we can't risk another government managing to, not with what he knows. I can't tell the president that. There are laws, protested the senator. Not for Delta. Conklin's words, though spoken softly, had the effect of a sudden cold wind. We've used his code name so much that I think we've forgotten Gordon Webb was his own brother. As the first rays of sun defined the landscape of Saint-Germain-en-Laye, they sat on the verge of a back road. In the Renault, the motel's night clerk thought he had lent them for a day, in exchange for lies and an outrageous sum. Bourne had told Marie the whole story of Kane, including the images that had exploded in his mind. Everything fitted. There wasn't anything that wasn't somewhere in the back of my head, trying to get out. He looked closely at her. We were wrong, don't you see?
Perhaps. But let me repeat. Offering your life for mine isn't the decision of the man you've described. If he ever existed, he doesn't any longer. Can you walk away from it?
Yes, said Bourne. But alone. Marie's voice was controlled, but the hand on her cigarette trembled.
I see. You'll heroically disappear, so I won't be tainted. Thank you very much. And who the hell do you think you are?
I'm wanted by police all over the world, and Carlos, for what I've done. How long before someone in one of those armies finds me? Is that the way you want your life to end?
Good God, no, shouted Marie. I intend to rot in a Swiss prison for 50 years.
I can confess, turn myself in. I don't know yet, but I can put your life back together. Marie reached for him, her voice soft once more.
You've just proved my point again. Kane would never do that. I have no answers, Jason. Only discrepancies I can't reconcile. I'm an analyst, remember? Not a wide-eyed flower child. I look very hard at those who attract me. And at myself. I know I couldn't love that man. But I do love you. This story is something people want you to believe. Your crimes. Suppose the evidence was planted, like it was against me in Zurich. Jason, you don't know when you lost your memory.
Port Noir.
That's when you began to build one. If you lost it before, it could explain the contradictions between you and Kane.
Marie looked at him, speaking gently.
I'm proficient with computers. If someone were looking for an amnesiac with specific skills and characteristics, the medical databanks could provide candidates. Not many in your case, perhaps only one. But one was all they needed.
You're saying I could be a reproduced illusion, Bourne said flatly.
I'm saying you may have been manipulated.
She touched his hand.
You tell me there are times when things want to burst out of you.
Words, places, names, they trigger things.
Isn't it possible they trigger false things? Things you've been told but can't see clearly because they're not you? Look at me and tell me you know without doubt you're an assassin. If you can do that, then take the blame for everything and get out of my life. But if you can't, let me help you.
Bourne took her hand. It's not just thoughts and feelings. The account at the Gemeinschaft goes back a long time and corresponds with everything I've learned.
But it could have been created yesterday, or last week, or 6 months ago. Everything you've learned could be part of a pattern designed by those who want you to take Gaines' place. You said everything fitted. It didn't, Jason, but this does.
And if we're wrong? Asked Bourne.
Leave me quickly or kill me. I don't care.
I love you.
I know. That's why I'm not afraid.
A blond man with tortoiseshell glasses and a stern-faced woman devoid of makeup were not out of place in Montmartre. They took a room at the Terrasse on the Rue de Mestre, registering as a married couple from Brussels. In the room, they came together and made love gently in the warm, rhythmic comfort of the bed. There was a foolish moment when adjustment of an angle was breathlessly necessary, and they laughed, then held each other more fiercely, sweeping away the world that kept them spinning in dark winds, plunging into another where sunlight and blue water replaced the darkness. Spent, they fell asleep, their fingers entwined. Bourne woke first. It was 1:10 in the afternoon. They had slept nearly 5 hours. Probably less than they needed, but enough. He turned to Marie, breathing deeply beside him, her parted lips inches from his. He kissed her, and she reached for him, her eyes still closed.
You're a frog, and I'll make you a prince,
she said sleepily.
Or is it the other way around?
Come on, open your eyes. Time to start hopping. From a telephone booth on the Rue Lafayette, Marie placed a call to the Zurich number Jason had found in Madame Lavier's office. The international operator came back to her.
We regret that the number you have called is no longer in service. It's urgent. Could you give me the name of the party who had this number? I'm afraid that's not possible. This is an unpublished listing. Good afternoon, madame.
Let's get out of here, said Bourne, looking up and down the street. Within 3 minutes, an exchange can be determined. In 4, they can narrow the blocks down to half a dozen.
How do you know that?
I wish I could tell you. They walked rapidly to the Boulevard Malesherbes, 10 blocks away, with a different exchange. This time, there were no operators to go through. Marie stepped inside another booth, coins in hand, and dialed. The words that came over the line so astonished her that for a moment she was unable to speak.
Je regrette, she whispered. Je me suis trompée de numéro.
And hung up. What? Asked Bourne.
I just reached the house of one of the most powerful men in France. General André Villiers, said Marie back at their hotel. Graduate of Saint-Cyr, hero of the resistance and de Gaulle's heir apparent until he broke with him over Algeria. Old aristocratic family. Today he's a senior deputy in the National Assembly, politically to the right of Charlemagne. To connect such a man with Carlos is like linking Douglas MacArthur to the Mafia.
After Algeria, what?
There was a reconciliation with de Gaulle. Villiers rose steadily in rank before he left the army for politics. He's a sort of elder statesman, still fuming over France's reduced military stature.
Howard Leyland was killed because he interfered with the Quai d'Orsay's arms exports, said Jason. There's your connection.
It seems incredible.
Marie was struck by a memory.
His son was murdered 5 or 6 years ago. He was a working politician too, also a conservative, obstructive over government expenditure, but quite popular.
I'm going to try to reach Villiers. Bourne crossed to the bedside table and picked up the telephone book. Let's see if he's listed, or if the number's private. I'll need his address.
If he's Carlos's connection, he'll be guarded, and they have your photograph, remember?
It won't help them. Here it is. Villiers, AF, Parc Monceau. Just knowing whom she was calling must have put the Lavier woman in shock. Carlos wants his drones to know he isn't kidding.
What's a drone?
Asked Marie. Someone who thinks he's doing one thing when he's really doing something else, said Bourne. Say I tell you to watch for a car at a certain corner. The car never shows up, but the fact that you're there tells someone watching you that something else has happened.
Arithmetically, an untraceable message. Walter Apfel was a drone. He released that story not knowing what he was really saying.
Treadstone, said Jason. Carlos found me in Zurich through the Gemeinschaft. That means he had to know about Treadstone. It's a good chance that Villiers does too. If he doesn't, there may be a way of getting him to find out. If he's all you say, he'll think pretty highly of his name. I'll threaten to go to the police, the papers.
You still have to get to him.
I will. I'm part chameleon, remember? The tree-lined street in Parc Monceau was lined with well-kept stone houses, a moneyed street in a wealthy section of the city, and Bourne had known one like it before. It was 7:35 on a clear, cold evening. Bourne's blonde hair was covered by a cap above the upturned collar of a jacket with the name of a messenger service across the back. Slung over his shoulder was a satchel containing brochures advertising the Bateau Mouche, picked up from a hotel lobby, which he was posting to random houses near General Villiers' residence, his eyes recording everything. Bourne was startled to realize that André Villiers, militarist, statesman, and the prime connection to Carlos, had no external security arrangements whatsoever. The man was either arrogant to the point of carelessness or a damn fool. As he climbed the steps of the next-door house and deposited his brochure in the slot, glancing at Villiers' windows in search of internal guards, the general's door suddenly opened. Bourne reached for his gun, thinking that someone had spotted him. But a middle-aged couple, a uniformed maid and a dark-jacketed man were in the doorway.
"Make sure the ashtrays are clean," said the woman. "You know how he hates full ashtrays. He won't be down for 10 minutes. He doesn't have to be in Nanterre until 8:30.
The man nodded and started down the steps. The door closed. Jason stood, watching the man hurry down the pavement. He was not sure where Nanterre was, only that it was a suburb of Paris. But if Villiers was driving there alone, there was no point in postponing the confrontation. Jason watched from the Renault as General Villiers came out of his house. A medium-height, barrel-chested man in his late 60s or early 70s, with close-cropped gray hair and a meticulously groomed white beard. His bearing was unmistakably military, imposing his body on the surrounding space. Bourne wondered what could have driven such a man into the obscene world of Carlos. The reason had to be powerful, for he was powerful, and that made him dangerous. Villiers walked briskly to the large saloon his man had brought round, started the engine, and rolled slowly off. When he reached the corner and turned right, Jason followed, in time to see Villiers turn right again a block east. General Villiers' route to Nanterre included a stretch of pasture, fields fusing into gentle hills. It occurred to Bourne, keeping up to a quarter of a mile behind, that this isolated road would be a good spot to intercept him on his return. A couple of miles later, he practically caught up with the old soldier. Villiers had slowed and was turning into a graveled drive through woods. A hanging sign read L'Arbalète. The general was meeting someone for dinner at an out-of-the-way restaurant, not in Nanterre, but in the nearby countryside. Bourne drove past the entrance and pulled off the road, suddenly consumed by an extraordinary possibility. Given the enormous embarrassment experienced by Carlos last night at the motel, had he summoned Villiers here for an emergency meeting? If so, the premises would be guarded, and a man whose photograph had been distributed to the guards would be shot the instant he was recognized. On the other hand, the chance to observe a nucleus belonging to Carlos, even Carlos himself, might never come again. He was compelled to take the risk. He checked his gun, got out and put on his coat over the logoed jacket, picked up a soft, narrow-brimmed hat. Turned down all round, it would cover his hair. Had he been wearing the glasses when the photograph was taken? No, he'd removed them when pain had seared through his head. He felt his shirt pocket. They were there if he needed them. He pressed the door closed and started for the woods. The glare of floodlights filtered through the trees, brightening as Bourne approached the car park. He was at the side of the restaurant, candles behind the windows illuminating the diners. The upper floor did not extend the full length of the building. The rear section was a terrace, but the enclosed part was another line of windows glowing with candles. Figures were milling about, standing, moving casually, glasses in hands, cigarette smoke spiraling over their heads. They were all men, more than 10, fewer than 20. Villiers was passing from one group to another, the white beard a beacon. The general had indeed driven out to Nanterre for a meeting. Where were the guards? Keeping to the woods, Bourne edged his way towards the front of the restaurant, bending branches silently. He stood motionless, watching for men concealed in the foliage or the shadows of the building. He saw none and retraced his path to the rear. A door opened with a spill of light, and a man in a white jacket emerged, cupping his hands, lighting a cigarette. Bourne looked left, right, up. No one appeared. There were no guards outside. Protection, as at Villiers' house, must be within the building itself. Another man appeared in the doorway, also wearing a white jacket, but with the addition of a chef's hat, his angry voice laced with Gascon.
"Well, you piece off! We sweat! The pastry cart's half empty! Fill it! Now, you bastard!"
The pastry man shrugged, crushed out his cigarette, and went back inside. Find Carlos. Kane is for Charlie, and Delta is for Kane. Bourne judged the distance and the obstacles. He was no more than 40 feet from the rear of the building, 10 or 12 below the railing of the terrace. There were 2 vents in the exterior wall, and next to them a drain pipe within reach of the railing. If he could scale the pipe and get a toe hold in the lower vent, he would be able to grab the balustrade and pull himself up. He took off his coat and hat, placed them at his feet, and covered both with undergrowth. Then he raced quietly across the gravel to the drain pipe. In the shadows, he tugged at the fluted metal. It would hold. Jason reached as high as he could, then sprang, gripping the pipe, pedaling until his left foot found the first vent. Balanced on that, he propelled himself further up the drain. One surge launched from the vent, and he reached the railing, balanced, and swung over. The terrace was clearly used for dining in the summer. In the center of the wall separating it from the upper room were glass double doors. The figures inside were motionless now, and for an instant Jason wondered whether an alarm had been set off, and froze, hand on his gun. But nothing happened. He approached the wall, staying in the shadows, pressed his back against the wood, and edged his way towards the doors. Slowly, he turned his face to the glass and looked in. The men stood in 3 lines, 4 to a line, facing Villiers, who was addressing them. 13 men in all, 12 of them standing to attention. They were old soldiers. None wore uniform, but in each lapel were ribbons, regimental colors, decorations. And they were men used to command. It was in their eyes, in the way they listened, respectfully but judging for themselves. If these men belonged to Carlos, his resources were not only far-reaching, but extremely dangerous. Unless he was grossly mistaken, thought Bourne, the range of experience and influence in that room was staggering. The general was raising his voice. Through the glass, the words became clear.
"Our presence will be felt, our purpose understood. We are together in our stand. We shall be heard. In memory of our brothers of the tunic and the cannon, who laid down their lives for the glory of France, we shall force our beloved country to remain strong. We pray to Almighty God that those who have gone before us have found peace, for we are still in conflict. Gentlemen, I give you France."
There was a murmur of approval, the old soldiers remaining rigidly at attention. And then another voice was raised, sang the first 5 words, and was joined at the 6th by the rest of the group.
"Allons enfants de la patrie, le jour de gloire est arrivé."
Bourne turned away, suddenly swept by feelings of anger and futility. He hated, despised men like Villiers and the others in that room. They were old men who made war, stealing life from the young. Why were the mists closing in again? There was no time for questions, no strength to tolerate them. He had to push them out of his mind and concentrate on André Villiers, whose cause belonged to yesterday, but whose pact with an assassin called for death today. Bourne sat 200 yards east of the restaurant entrance, the motor running and headlights on, waiting for Villiers. When the long black chassis appeared in the gateway, he pulled out fast, making the general wait for him to pass, then pressed the pedal to the floor until he reached the isolated stretch of road. He made a U-turn, waited again until he saw the headlights approaching, then accelerated, caroming over the road. Villiers perforce slowed down. 20 feet from collision, Bourne spun the wheel, skidding to a halt with a loud cry of shock. He crouched in his seat, gun on his lap, peering through the steering wheel as the old man walked towards the Renault, his call anxious yet commanding. "What do you think you're doing? Are you all right?" "Yes," replied Bourne, raising the gun, and got out. "Walk back to your car. Drive it off the road." "Are you from the Red Brigade? Or Bader Meinhof? I spit at you. You'll accomplish nothing by killing me, less by kidnapping me. There can be no negotiations with terrorists. Use your gun, garbage!" Jason studied the old soldier, suddenly uncertain. The truth would be in the furious eyes when he coupled a name soaked in filth with another heaped with honors. General Villiers, Carlos's lackey. The fury was joined by abhorrence. Villiers' hand shot up, the crack against Bourne's face accurate and painful, followed by a forward slap that reeled him back on his feet. The old man moved in, blocked by the barrel of the gun, but unafraid. "Pig!" screamed Villiers, his hands swinging up, crashing down. "Kill me if you can, if you dare!" Jason threw down the gun, grabbed Villiers' wrists and twisted, bending the old man into him, immobilized, their faces inches apart. "Are you telling me you're not Carlos's man?" Villiers spat in his face. "Carlos killed my son," he said. "My only son!" Jason slowly reduced the pressure and spoke as calmly as he could. "Then drive your car into the field. We have to talk, General." The old man heard Bourne out in silence, and then said, "Impossible. An incredible mistake has been made." "No, and it's a magnificent cover. Nobody would ever connect you with Carlos, especially in view of your son's death. Is it common knowledge that was Carlos?" "Within military intelligence and Interpol, certainly. It was presumed that he did a favor for friends of his radical days, even allowing them to claim responsibility. The extremists were forming a false coalition with the socialists, making promises they had no intention of keeping. My son exposed it." "Is that why you stood for election?" "It is customary for the son to carry on for the father. In this case, it was for the father to carry on for the son." "So what was that back at the restaurant? Those men looked as if they ran half the armies in France." "They did. Had they been heeded then, France would not have fallen. Now most live on pensions and work to prevent the past being repeated. Conspiracy is everywhere. It cannot go unchallenged. But please, this incredible misinformation of yours, it's unthinkable." "Which makes it the perfect relay. Someone at your number is in direct contact with Carlos. Do you answer the telephone yourself?" Villiers frowned. "Actually, no. Not that one. I have a private line." "Who does?" "Generally the housekeeper or my man, her husband. He was my driver in the army. My wife, of course, or my aide, who often works at my house. He was my adjutant for 20 years. No one else." "You'd better take a closer look at your man and the adjutant. Everything I've told you is the truth." "But you haven't told me much, have you?" the old man said. "An unnamed man traps me on a lonely road and makes an accusation so filthy I wish to kill him. Why should I believe him?" "Because," answered Bourne, "I'd have no reason to come to you unless I believed it." Villiers stared at him. "No, there's a better reason. You threw down your gun." The old man gestured towards the Renault. "Follow me back to Parc Monceau and we'll talk further. But I'd swear on my life that you're wrong about both men." Jason eyed him. "Why Parc Monceau? How do I know it isn't a trap?" "Where else? And I want my wife to hear what you had to say. She's an old soldier's wife. I've come to rely on her perceptions. As to your trap, you have my word. If that's not good enough for you, take your weapon and get out." The drive back seemed far longer than the one out. Jason was fighting images again, and pain starting at his temples, sweeping down to knot his stomach. Death in the skies. Birds, machines, racing down out of the sky. Explosions. Death. Of the young. They entered the tree-lined street. Villiers, 100 feet ahead, parked in a space opposite his house large enough for both cars. As Jason pulled in behind, his eyes were drawn by a light, his focus suddenly on the figures in it. The recognition was so startling he found himself reaching for the gun. At the door of Villiers' house stood a striking youngish woman, talking to the switchboard operator from Les Classiques, the man whose face had triggered other images. Bourne's eyes darted to Villiers, who was about to get out of his car. He rolled forward until he made contact with the saloon's bumper. As Villiers whipped round in his seat, Bourne extinguished his headlights, turned on the interior light, and signaled him to stay where he was. He looked back at the door. The man had taken a step down. Bourne could see the woman clearly now. She was in her 30s, with short dark hair framing a bronzed face. Tall, statuesque, the swell of her breasts accentuated by a close-fitting white dress. A visitor who knew when to come to Villiers' home. It would fit the strategy of relay removed from relay. The old man must know her, but how well? The man gave a final nod, descended the steps, and walked rapidly away. The door closed. Bourne got out of the Renault and walked to Villiers' car. The window was rolled down, the general's face turned up, eyebrows arched in curiosity. "Who was the woman at your house?" Jason asked. "Do you know her?"
I should hope so. She's my wife.
"Your wife?" Bourne's shock was on his face. "I thought you said she was an old woman."
I said she was an old soldier's woman. She is the second Madame Villiers.
Villiers opened the car door.
Wait here. I'll go in. If everything's normal, I'll open the door and summon you. If not, I'll come back and we'll drive away.
Bourne remained motionless, blocking the door. Oh, Jesus. General, that man who was talking to your wife, he's a contact to Carlos. The beggar scratched his stubble, took off his beret, and trudged through the bronze doors of the church in Neuilly-sur-Seine. He walked down the right aisle, knelt in the second pew, head bent as if in prayer, and pushed back his sleeve to check an expensive digital watch. He had once been late, with no excuse but the lack of an accurate timepiece. At their next appointment, Carlos had pushed it under the screen. It was the hour and the minute. The beggar rose and walked to the second booth.
Angelus Domini. Angelus Domini, child of God.
The whisper was harsh.
Are your days comfortable? They are made comfortable. Very well, interrupted the silhouette. What happened in Montrouge? Who was responsible for the lies from the embassy? Our people are sure Corbelier was duped. By Kane. But why does he relay nothing to Washington? It's possible he wants no interference from his superiors, said the beggar. American intelligence has many autocrats. Perhaps Kane waits until he thinks there are no more options to be argued. Or perhaps he really has turned. Washington thinks so. Yet the monk said that he didn't know what had happened. Wasn't even certain the man was Kane. Perhaps he said it to deceive. There's something else. I went to Montrouge. The night clerk rented his car at 3 o'clock yesterday morning to a blonde man with a woman. The description fits the photograph from Argenteuil. Why would Kane obtain a car in such a fashion? To get away? Perhaps, said the beggar. Or he could have obtained it to follow someone here in Paris. No loitering in public, no searches for elusive taxis. Simply a nondescript black Renault. Les Classiques, said the assassin softly. It's the only place he has to start. Do you have a full description of the car? Down to 3 dents in the rear bumper. Spread the word. Comb the streets, the garages, the parking lots. The man who finds it will never have to look for work again.
An envelope was slipped between the curtain and the frame.
If your theory proves right, consider this a token. I am right, said the beggar. Kane does what you would do, what I would have done in the old days. He must be respected. "He must be killed," said Carlos. "In a few days, it will be the 25th of March, the date Jason Bourne was executed in the jungles of Tamquan. Tell the old men, if they find him, to get word to Park Monceau and keep him in sight, but do nothing. On the 25th of March, I'll execute him myself."
Bourne had talked at some length. Now he and Villiers walked in silence down the moonlit path in the Bois de Boulogne. His story was true, that he had to find Carlos, learn what he knew, or there would be no life for him. But there was no mention of Marie Saint-Jacques, the Ile de Port-Noir, or a walking shell who couldn't even be sure such memories as he possessed were his own. Instead, he recounted all he knew about Carlos, which was so much it astonished Villiers. All France's files on Carlos could not match Jason's array of facts.
This woman Lavier, the one who telephones my house, admitted being a courier.
The general paused.
She had your photograph taken, because they had none before. So, as you hunt Carlos, he hunts you. But you have no photograph. You only know 2 couriers, one of whom was speaking with my wife tonight.
Yes. That was when the silence began. They came to a miniature lake, bordered with white gravel, benches spaced around it.
"I should like to sit down,"
Villiers said.
"With age comes a paucity of stamina. It often embarrasses me."
He paused for a moment.
"Frequently in the company of my wife. There are times when I need to leave a dinner party early, or decline a few days on the slopes in Stade. In many ways, my wife and I live quite separate lives."
"I don't understand."
"When an old man finds a stunning young woman anxious to share his life, certain things are understood," said Villiers. "Creature comforts, entry into great houses, friendship with the celebrated. In exchange for these, one brings a beautiful companion into one's home, shows her off among one's peers. But there are always doubts."
"You felt it then?" asked Jason quietly.
"Feelings are not reality,"
shot back the old soldier.
"There could be a simple explanation for what we saw tonight, and I shall give her the opportunity to provide it. But in my heart I know there isn't. I knew it the moment you told me about Les Classiques."
"But you said you trusted her judgment. What fell into place for you?" Villiers looked at Jason.
"You have extraordinary knowledge about Carlos, but solely his kills. He not only sells his gun, he sells secrets. I, and perhaps 5 other men, all above suspicion, have access to classified documents dealing with France's security. Yet with damning regularity, we find that Moscow has learned this, Washington that, Peking something else."
"You discussed those things with your wife?" asked Bourne.
"Of course not. Whenever I bring such papers home, they are placed in a safe in my office. But she has a key. At my age, death can come any time. If that happens, she has instructions to telephone a brevet militaire, go to my office, and stay by that safe until the security personnel arrive."
Villiers closed his eyes.
"All along, it was she."
"Are you sure?"
"More than I dare admit. She insisted on the marriage. I brought up the disparity of our ages, but she would have none of it. She offered to renounce any claim to the estate, and of course I saw that as proof of her commitment. The old fool is the complete fool, Yet there were always doubts. The trips, the unexpected separations."
"Unexpected?"
"She has many interests. A museum in Grenoble, a gallery in Amsterdam, a monument to the Resistance in Boulogne-sur-Mer, an oceanography conference in Marseille. We argued over that one. There were diplomatic functions I had to attend, and I wanted her with me. She wouldn't stay."
Grenoble, an hour from Zurich. Amsterdam, Boulogne-sur-Mer, an hour from London. Marseille. Carlos. When was the conference in Marseille? Asked Jason.
Late last August.
On the 24th of August, Ambassador Howard Leland was assassinated on the Marseille waterfront.
I know, said Villiers. I mourn the man, if not his judgments.
He stopped.
My God, he whispered. She had to be with him. Carlos summoned her, and she went to him.
Suddenly the old man brought his hands to his face and wept. Bourne did not move. There was nothing he could do. When the general regained control, he sat erect, his jaw firm.
I shall do what has to be done. She will tell me the truth, and she will die.
No, insisted Jason. Think of your son. Go after the killer, not the accomplice. Don't confront her yet. Use what you know against Carlos. No one's ever been this close. A cloud floated by, briefly blocking the moon. The old soldier spoke, resignation in his voice.
You're right. It's the killer, not the whore, who must be stopped. How do we hunt together?
Bourne closed his eyes briefly in relief. Carlos must be looking for me all over Paris. I've killed his men, uncovered a drop. Your phone will become busy. I'll make sure of it. I'll intercept half a dozen employees of Les Classiques, panic them. That phone will be busy as hell.
But what do I do?
Stay at home. Say you're ill, and whenever the phone rings, stay nearby. You could even listen in. You probably won't hear anything, but you'll frustrate them. And depending on where your wife is in Carlos's hierarchy, we might even force him to demand a meeting with her.
He would hardly announce the whereabouts.
He has to tell her. Bourne paused, then another thought coming into focus. If the disruption is severe enough, there'll be one phone call, or a visitor you don't know, and shortly after, your wife will tell you she has to go somewhere. Insist she leaves a number where she can be reached.
What will that serve?
It'll tell you where she is. Maybe where Carlos is, certainly others close to him. Then reach me. I'll give you a hotel and a room number. If I'm not there when you call, a woman will answer. The general drew back.
You said nothing about a woman. Does she know about me?
Yes. She told me you couldn't be allied with Carlos.
Thank her for me.
Bourne nodded. Can you be sure your private line isn't tapped?
Absolutely. It is swept regularly. All the telephones restricted by the brevet.
What's the number? Villiers gave it.
And your hotel?
He asked. The Terrasse, Rue de Mestre, Montmartre, room 420.
When will you begin?
As soon as possible.
Be like a wolf pack,
said the general.
Strike swiftly.
Janine Dolbert and Claude Auréal, repeated Marie into the telephone she'd been gushing down. Thank you so much. Goodbye.
She hung up. If you ever decide to get out of economics, said Jason, pouring through the Paris telephone books, go into sales. I bought every word you said. Here it is. Dolbert, Janine, Rue Losseran. Jason wrote down the address. Marie lit a cigarette.
You're really going to go to their homes?
Bourne nodded. Carlos will have Les Classiques watched. Today's for the groundswell. Get them running around saying things that shouldn't be said. The general's phone will start ringing this afternoon. By closing time, word will be spread throughout the store. I'll reach 2 others tonight. By morning, the panic should be complete.
How are you going to get them away from Les Classiques during working hours?
Asked Marie. Get their concierges to call them to come home right away to deal with an urgent personal problem. Who hasn't got one? Bourne's finger was once again sliding down a column of names. Got him. Auréal, Claude Giselle, Rue Racine.
Who are the other 2?
I'll get names from either Auréal or Dolbert or both. They'll give me the second shockwave. Jason stood in a doorway 15 feet from the entrance to Janine Dolbert's apartment house, where a bewildered concierge had obliged a well-spoken, generous stranger by calling Mademoiselle Dolbert at work to tell her that a gentleman in a chauffeured limousine was there asking for her. What should the concierge do? A taxi pulled up, and Janine Dolbert jumped out. Jason intercepted her on the pavement. "That was quick," he said, touching her elbow. "So nice to see you again." Janine Dolbert stared at him in recollection, then astonishment.
Monsieur Briggs, isn't it? What could you wish to see me about?
"Don't you know? Then why did you race back here?" The wide eyes beneath the short bobbed hair were fixed on his.
You're from the House of Azure, then?
She asked.
There will be no more. We agreed. When the autumn line comes out, with you parading half Bergeron's designs before he does, how long do you think I can stay at Les Classiques? You'd better take care of me as you promised in one of your Los Angeles shops.
"Let's walk," said Jason, gently propelling her. "You've got the wrong man, Janine. I've never heard of the House of Azure, and I have no interest in stolen designs."
Oh my God! Then what do you want? What I said was a lie. I was testing you. I'm loyal to Les Classiques.
"I admire loyalty. I was saying that the other day to, what's his name? That fellow on the switchboard."
Philippe,
said the salesgirl, frightened and obsequious.
Philippe d'Anjou.
"That's it." Jason guided her into a narrow alley between two buildings, walked 10 paces and stopped. "Cigarette?" he asked, taking a packet from his pocket. Janine accepted, and he lit it for her.
Thank you. What do you want, Monsieur Briggs?
"I was sure Levier's #1 girl would have told you."
Monique?
"Last names, please. Accuracy's important."
Brielle, then,
said Janine.
What is it, monsieur?
Jason shook his head. "You really don't know? Let's just say I'm the spokesman for a group of people closing in on a killer. The assassin known as Carlos."
Carlos?
Janine gaped.
I've heard nothing of this.
"Then I apologize," said Bourne. "You should have been contacted weeks ago. Carlos is one of your most frequent customers. We've narrowed the probabilities down to 8 men. The trap is set for some time in the next few days, and we're taking every precaution. Gunfire will be kept to a minimum. The basic problem is that he walks around wired up to enough explosives for a 1,000-pound bomb. But we can handle that. One clean shot to the head and it'll be over." Bourne looked at his watch. "You've got to get back, and so have I. If you see me outside, you don't know me. If I come into Les Classiques, treat me like any client. Unless you've spotted a customer you think may be our man, then waste no time in telling me. Sorry about the breakdown in communications." He nodded and walked rapidly out of the alley. Jason sat by the door of a cafe on the Rue Racine, prepared to get up the moment he saw Claude Auréal arrive at the ancient building across the street. When he did, Bourne was sure he would be running, for Claude had been told by his landlady to get his worthless self back home and put a stop to the screaming and crashing coming from his flat before she called the gendarme. A slight frame in a Pierre Cardin suit raced up the pavement from the metro exit and into the house. Jason rapidly followed. As he started up the narrow staircase, he could hear the pounding on a door above.
Ouvrez! Vite, nom de Dieu!
Bourne climbed until he could see Auréal between the banisters pressed against a door on the 4th floor, his ear to the wood, his face flushed. "Sûreté!" called Jason. "Stay where you are, young man. Let's not have any unpleasantness. We've been watching you and your friends."
No!
screamed Auréal.
It has nothing to do with me, I swear!
Bourne raised his hand. "Quiet." He leant over the railing and looked below, then stood up and approached Auréal. "Get inside and be quiet," he whispered harshly. "That was for the benefit of the old bitch downstairs. Open up." Terrified, Claude Auréal fumbled for his key, unlocked the door, and pushed it open. Bourne propelled him inside and closed the door. "I've only got a few minutes," said Jason. "No time for anything but business. We received word from Zurich, and we want you to get it to Lavier. We can't trust the phones. Tell her Carlos is right."
Carlos? Carlos who?
"The assassin." Claude Auréal brought his hand up to his mouth and shrieked,
What are you saying?
"Be quiet. We're counting on you. They're closing in. Carlos is to stay away. They'll surround the shop, marksmen every 10 feet. If he's in there, it could be a massacre." Auréal screamed again.
Stop! You're a maniac, and I won't hear another word. Carlos, massacres. Oh, God, I need air.
"You'll get money. Lavier will thank you.
Also Donjou. He's number 6.
What are these numbers? I won't listen. I'm a couturier, an artist.
You're number 5. You'll do exactly as we say, or you'll never see this passion pit again. Incidentally, we don't trust the bookkeeper. We think he's working for Interpol.
Trignon?
First names only.
Pierre, then. Oh, he's hateful. He deducts for telephone calls.
Keep your eye on him, especially during the next 2 days. If he leaves the store for any reason, watch out. It could mean the trap's closing.
Bourne walked to the door, his hand in his pocket.
I've got to get back. Tell numbers 1 to 6 everything I told you. Reach Lavier, Donjou, Bergeron as quickly as you can, then the others.
What others?
Ask number 2, Janine Dolbert.
The salesman flung his arms wildly in helpless protest.
This is madness. Nothing makes sense.
Your life does, Claude, said Jason simply. Value it. Don't use the phone. Just get back to Les Classiques. If you're not out of here in 3 minutes, I'll have to return. He took his gun out of his pocket.
Auréal expelled a lungful of air, his face ashen. Bourne let himself out and closed the door. At 8:15, the telephone rang on the bedside table.
Is this room 420?
Asked a deep male voice.
Yes,
Said Marie. Villiers. Panic had spread through Les Classiques. The general had called earlier to tell Jason that his wife had been summoned to the phone 6 times in an hour and a half.
I know who you are.
I'm also aware of you. May I take the liberty of thanking you? Tell our mutual friend that the crisis has accelerated. My wife has taken to her room, claiming nausea, but apparently she's not too ill to be on the phone. Several times I picked it up, but they were alert for interference. Each time I apologized, saying I expected calls. I'm not sure she was convinced. There is friction building between us. May God give me strength.
Remember the objective, insisted Marie. Remember your son. I'll convey what you've told me to our friend.
Please,
Interrupted Villiers.
there's more. One voice held meaning for me. I did not know it, but it was half whisper, half command. It was the command that struck me. It was altered the instant I got on the line, but the residue remained. That residue is well known to any soldier. It was the killer, instructing my wife.
The old soldier's voice cracked.
Forgive me. I have no right to burden you.
You have every right,
Said Marie, alarmed.
What's happening must be terribly painful for you, but please, try to hold on. It could cost you your life if she suspects you.
I think perhaps I have lost it.
Ne soyez pas ridicule,
Said Marie sharply, a deliberate slap in the old man's face.
Vous êtes soldat. On dit que vous êtes un géant.
She held her breath until Villiers spoke.
You are a remarkable woman. You remind an old man of who and what he is. I thank you a second time.
Marie hung up, moved and disturbed. Unless Villiers could face the next 24 hours, Carlos would know how deeply his apparatus had been penetrated. In which case, there would be no answers, no address in New York, and the man she loved would leave her. Bourne recognized Monique Brielle from the boutique, a more sinewy version of Janine Dolbert with a confident stride. He caught up with her 30 paces from her pension and slowed his pace to hers.
Get in touch with Lavier right away, he said.
Pardon? The American. Janine, Claude, all afternoon, nothing but Carlos, and numbers, talks of traps and men with guns. Jacqueline said you must be a provocateur, paid by one of the other houses to ruin us.
Did she also tell you not to say a word about any of this to anyone? Not to contact the police?
Yes, naturally.
Not naturally, contradicted Bourne. Look, I'm not here to convince you, but to deliver a message. We fed Dolbert false information. She's been talking to Azur. It could be tied in with the trap.
Trap? This is craziness. Nobody knows what you're talking about.
Lavier knows. Get in touch with her right away. They approached her block. Jason touched her arm. Call Jacqueline. Tell her it's more serious than we thought. Tell her to be careful. Of everyone. If she isn't,
It could be the end for us all.
Bourne released her arm, then stepped off the curb and crossed the street. On the other side, he stopped and glanced back. Monique Brielle was halfway down the block, rushing towards her pension. The second shockwave had begun. Time to call Marie.
I'm worried, Jason,
said Marie when he called her at 9.
It's tearing him apart. He nearly broke down on the phone.
He'll handle it, said Bourne, wishing he felt more confident about Villiers. If he doesn't, I've killed him. I should have shut my goddamn mouth and taken her myself.
You saw Donjou on the steps. You couldn't have gone in.
I could have done something.
You are doing something. You're creating panic. Someone's got to stop it, and you said you didn't think Jacqueline Lavier was high enough. Jason, you'll see someone and you'll know. You'll get him.
I hope so. I know what I'm doing, but every now and then... Bourne stopped. He hated saying it, but to her he had to. I get confused. It's as if I'm split down the middle. One part of me saying, save yourself, the other telling me to get Carlos. The sky was dark outside. It had once been so bright, so blinding, and hot, not cold, with screeching birds and screaming streaks of metal.
Jason, come back. You're tired. You need rest.
I have to reach Trignon, the bookkeeper.
It can wait until tomorrow,
insisted Marie. No, tomorrow's for the captains. Bourne closed his eyes. The sweat was drying, and the sounds of traffic replaced the screeching in his ears. I'm all right now. A couple of bad moments, that's all. Marie spoke slowly, forcing him to listen.
What caused them? Did the Brielle woman say something that made you think of something else?
Bourne closed his eyes, trying to remember. She called me a provocateur, he said. But then, that's what I am, aren't I? I've got to get going. I need to reach Trignon.
Be careful,
Marie said.
I believe in you.
At the apartment block listed as Pierre Trignon's residence, a row of brass letterboxes was on the right of the door, an intercom below each. Jason ran his finger along the names to Monsieur Pierre Trignon and pushed the button twice. Monsieur Trignon, s'il vous plaît, télégramme. Bourne waited, hearing the clatter of footsteps growing louder as someone hurried down the staircase. A balding, heavy-set man, braces creasing the flesh beneath a bulging white shirt, appeared. Monsieur Trignon, I apologize for the ruse, but I didn't think you'd want to be questioned in front of your wife and family. You work for a firm called Les Classiques? I do, said the man, his eyes frightened. There is no telegram. Who are you? A special investigator for the Bureau of Taxation and Records, said Jason. I must warn you that the Bureau will sequester your books in the morning. Be prepared. Sequester? For what cause? Payments on fraudulent invoices, routed to Zurich. I don't know what you're talking about. Every invoice is initialed by Madame Lavier. Ask anyone. Les Classiques does not pay a sou unless authorized by Madame. Bourne frowned. You're saying, then, that you take your orders directly from her? From whom does she take orders? Trignon grinned nervously. It is said from God, when not the other way round. Of course, that's a joke, monsieur. I trust you can be more serious. Who are the owners? A partnership. Madame Lavier has wealthy friends who have invested in her abilities, and of course the talents of René Bergeron. We may have concentrated on the wrong people, said Bourne. It's possible that you and Madame Lavier are being used. You prepared the checks. Did you ever check the merchandise against the invoices? It's not my job. Trignon's stomach quivered. I pay only invoices that have been initialed. You'd better find every one, or you may face charges as an accessory to multiple homicide. The account in Zurich belongs to the assassin Carlos. You, Monsieur Trignon, and your employer are implicated in financing the most sought-after killer in Europe. Trignon's eyes were shocked, his puffy features distorted. All afternoon, he whispered. People looking at me strangely, passing my cubicle and turning their heads. Oh, my God. Jason said, It's not my place to advise you, but if I were you, I'd reach Madame Lavier at once. Start preparing your joint defense. The chameleon turned and went, the cold night air whipping across his face. Get Carlos. Sunlight burst through the stained-glass windows as the old man in the dated suit rushed down the aisle of the church in Neuilly-sur-Seine. The priest, standing by the rack of novena candles, was struck by a sense of familiarity, but could not place the man. There had been a beggar yesterday about the same size.
Angelus Domini,
said the old man as he parted the curtains of the confessional.
Enough,
whispered the silhouette behind the screen.
What have you learned? Little of substance, but respect for his methods. He selects people who know nothing and instigates chaos through them. I would suggest no further activity at Les Classiques. Naturally,
agreed the silhouette.
But what's his purpose? Beyond the chaos?
Asked the old man.
I'd guess to spread distrust among those who do know something. The Brielle woman said Kane told her to tell Lavier there was a traitor. And last night, as you know, Trignon went crazy, screaming in the street. Lavier herself was barely in control when she called Park-Monceau. No one is to call her ever again. We received word. The few who know the number have forgotten it. Be sure you have.
The silhouette moved suddenly. There was a ripple in the curtain.
He is a madman and obsessed. He may be both, countered the old man, but he's also a professional. He'll make sure the names are delivered to his superiors in case he fails. So whether you take him or not, they will be taken. They will be dead, said the assassin, but not Bergeron. He's far too valuable. Tell him to head for Athens. He'll know where. For now, you will relay my decisions to whomever they concern. And the first person I reach is Bergeron. To Athens. Yes. Lavier and Donjou are marked. Tell the teams covering them I'll be watching. There can be no mistakes. It shall be done.
The old man paused.
I've saved the best for last, Carlos. The Renault was found an hour and a half ago, in a garage in Montmartre.
In the stillness, he could hear Carlos's deliberate breathing.
I assume you've taken measures to have it watched and followed?
The part-time beggar laughed.
I hired a friend with a sound car. He has employed 3 acquaintances, and they are on 6-hour shifts on the street outside to follow the Renault at any hour of day or night. You do not disappoint me. I can't afford to. Since Park-Monceau is eliminated, how can I reach you if I must? Say, for instance, the Renault. Are you aware of the burden you asked for? I would prefer not to have it. My hope is that when this is over, you will remember my contributions, and rather than killing me, change the number.
The assassin whispered 7 figures.
You are the only man alive who has this number. Naturally, it is untraceable. Kane will be caught. His body thrown back to the strategist who created him. In the end, he was only a puppet. Everyone knew it, but him.
Bourne picked up the telephone. Yes? Go ahead, General.
The telephone calls have stopped, but 30 minutes ago a woman came to the house. I only saw her face for a moment, but she was in panic.
Describe her. Villiers did. Jacqueline Lavier, said Jason.
From the look of her, the wolf pack was eminently successful. My wife told me she was an old friend in a marriage crisis.
I can't understand her going to your house. It's too much of a risk. Unless she did it on her own initiative.
These things occurred to me, so I felt in need of a stroll around the block. Lavier was followed. 2 men in a car, equipped with a radio.
How do you know she didn't come with them?
When she arrived, I was in the sitting room and heard her running up the steps. I went to the window in time to see a taxi drive away.
When did she leave?
She hasn't, and the men are still outside.
What kind of a car are they in?
A grey Citroën. The letters of the license plate are NYR.
I'm going to try to get to your house before Lavier leaves, said Jason. Do what you can to help me. Interrupt your wife. Say you have to speak to her. Say anything. Just make sure she doesn't leave.
I will do my best.
Bourne hung up and looked at Marie standing by the window. It's working. Lavier went to Parc Monceau and was followed. They're beginning to suspect their own. He walked to the chair where he dropped his coat and hat, put them on quickly, and went to the bureau for the gun. Find Carlos. False. God damn you, false. Find Treadstone. Jason remained in the corner of the back seat as the taxi entered Villier's street. He scanned the cars lining the curb. There was no gray Citroën with the letters NYR. But Villiers was standing on the pavement, 4 doors away from his house. It was a signal. Arrêtez, s'il vous plaît, said Bourne to the driver. Le vieux homme. Je demanderai à lui. He rolled down the window and leaned forward. Monsieur? In English, Villiers replied, My wife left with Lavier. I could not detain them. She said that her friend insisted on seeing a priest in Neuilly-sur-Seine at the Church of the Blessed Sacrament, and she felt obliged to accompany her. And she said, If you want to check up on me, André, why not call the parish? I'm sure someone might recognize me and bring me to a telephone. Was she testing me? Bourne tried to think. Perhaps. Someone would see her there. She'd make sure of it. But bringing her to a phone might be another thing. When did they leave? Less than 5 minutes ago, in a taxi. The Citroën followed. Bourne dropped a 50-franc note over the back of the front seat. The driver grabbed it. It's important I reach Neuilly-sur-Seine as fast as possible, said Jason. The Church of the Blessed Sacrament. Do you know where it is? Of course, monsieur. It is the most beautiful church in the district. Get there quickly and there'll be another 50 francs. We shall fly on the wings of angels, monsieur. The flight plan jeopardized most of the traffic in their path. There are the spires of the Blessed Sacrament, monsieur, said the driver 12 minutes later, pointing through the windscreen. Another minute, perhaps 2, if the idiots who should be taken off the streets will permit. Slow down, interrupted Bourne, his attention not on the spires, but on a car several vehicles ahead. A gray Citroën, 2 men in the front seat. They stopped at a red light. Jason dropped a second 50-franc note over the seat and opened the door. I'll be right back. If the light changes, drive forward slowly and I'll jump in. Keeping low, he ducked between the cars until he saw the letters NYR. The numbers were 768. The light changed and the row of vehicles lurched forward. The taxi drew alongside, Jason climbed in, and they approached the church. The Citroën made the final turn 1 car behind a taxi, its passengers indistinguishable. There is the Blessed Sacrament, said Jason's driver, entering the street where the church rose from a manicured lawn crisscrossed by paths and dotted with statuary. Pull in there, ordered Jason, gesturing at a space in the line of parked cars. The leading taxi had stopped at a path guarded by a stone saint. Villier's stunning wife got out first, extending her hand to Jacqueline Lavier, who wore large orange-rimmed sunglasses and carried a white bag. But the once regal woman's silver-streaked hair fell straight down the sides of her white face. Her stockings were torn, and her movements hesitant. The gray Citroën was pulling into the curb ahead of the taxi. Neither man got out, but the radio antenna began rising out of the boot.
Almanac to Delta. Respond as ordered. Abandon. That is final. Delta to Almanac. You're final, brother. Go fuck yourself. Delta out.
Suddenly, the darkness was all around Bourne, the shapes of foliage shivering beneath iridescent clouds. Everything was moving. He had to move with the movement and take them out. Crawl in closer, overcome the fear, and reduce the numbers. The monk had made that clear. The monk? Sunlight came again, blinding him for a moment. Jason jerked his head up, suddenly aware of where he was and what he was doing. His face had been pressed against the window. His breath had fogged the glass. I'm getting out for a few minutes, he said. Wait here. He pulled up his collar, pushed his hat forward, and put on the glasses. then walked alongside a couple towards a religious stall, where he stood behind a mother and child with a clear view of the Citroën. The taxi that had brought the women was gone. 3 minutes later, Villier's wife strode out of the church, carrying Jacqueline Lavier's white bag. She went directly to the Citroën, spoke to the men, then got into the back. The car rolled away, the antenna retracting into its base. Where was Lavier? Why had she given her bag to Villier's wife? Bourne started to move, then stopped. If Lavier was followed, those following her might also be trailed. He looked up and down the street, watching for a face that didn't belong. There were no darting eyes or hands concealed in pockets. Neuilly-sur-Seine was not a trap for Bourne. He started for the church. A priest was coming out, in a black suit, white dog collar, and a soutane that partially covered his face. Jason stopped. He'd seen him before. Not in the forgotten past, but recently. He knew the walk, the tilt of his head, the shoulders that seemed to glide above the fluid movement of his body. A man with a gun. The man in the priestly habit turned right, his face briefly caught in the sunlight. The skin was dark, tanned not by the sun, but by birth. A Latin skin. Bourne stood paralyzed by the shock of his own certainty. He was looking at Carlos. Get Carlos. Jason started running, colliding with strollers, shouldering a pavement vendor out of his way, lurching past a beggar, digging in a rubbish. The beggar's hand surged into his pocket. Bourne spun in time to see an automatic emerge from the threadbare coat. He lunged into the road, caroming off the side of a small car, heard the spit of bullets, screams from people on the pavement. Bourne ducked between two cars to the other side of the street. The beggar was racing into the crowds, into oblivion. Get Carlos. Jason spun again, running in the direction the assassin had gone, anger welling in his chest, sharp bolts of pain in his temples. Where was he? And then he saw him. The killer had climbed behind the wheel of a large black saloon. Bourne slammed bonnets and boots as he threaded his way insanely towards Carlos, then stopped. The car had found a break in the traffic, and Ilich Ramirez Sanchez sped away. Lavier. Bourne turned back towards the church, ran up the steps and entered, facing racks of flickering candles, rays of colored light from the stained glass windows. He walked down the nave, looking for streaked silver hair and a white mask of a face. Lavier was nowhere to be seen. There was a tall priest walking past the rack of candles. Bourne sidestepped through a pew and intercepted him. "Excuse me, Father," he said. "Two women came in a few minutes ago. One was tall, quite striking, wearing a light-colored coat. The other an older lady, obviously not in good health. Did you by any chance see them?" The priest nodded. "Yes, her friend escorted the older lady to confession. She has a compassionate father-confessor, I may add. A visiting priest from Barcelona. I'm sorry to say this is his last day." He frowned. "That's odd. I thought I saw Father Manuel leave a few moments ago. No matter. The poor soul is in good hands." "I'm sure," said Bourne. "Thank you, Father." He walked down the aisle towards the confessional booths, his eyes on the second, where the drawn curtains proclaimed occupancy. He glanced at the rear of the church. The tall priest was at the door, his attention on the disturbance in the street. Bourne parted the curtains and saw what he expected to see. Jacqueline Lavier was slumped on the prie-dieu, her face upturned, her coat open, her dress drenched in blood, her fingers curled around the handle of a long, thin letter opener above her left breast. At her feet was a bag. Not the white one she had clutched before, but an Yves Saint Laurent. Inside, Jason knew, would be papers indicating a tragic suicide. Carlos was thorough. The taxi wandered aimlessly through Neuilly-sur-Seine, Jason in the back seat, his mind racing. Jacqueline Lavier's death was out of sequence. She was still valuable. Then he understood. She had been killed not because she was a danger to Carlos, but because she had disobeyed him. She had gone to Parc Monceau. There was another known relay at Les Classiques, Philippe d'Anjou, whose face evoked images of violence and darkness. He had been in Bourne's past, so Jason must be doubly cautious, because he too would be watched, as Lavier had been. Were these the only two, or were there others? A clerk, perhaps, or a supplier, or René Bergeron, whose movements were so fluid. Bourne suddenly stiffened, a recent memory triggered. Bergeron. The dark tan, the wide shoulders accentuated by rolled-up sleeves, shoulders that floated above a tapered waist, beneath which strong legs moved swiftly, like a cat's. Was it possible? Was the assassin, unknown to his relays, deep inside his own apparatus? "The first telephone box you see, pull over," he said to the driver, who was still shaken by the chaos at the Church of the Blessed Sacrament. The kiosk smelled of urine. Bourne dialed the terrace. "Marie, I haven't time to explain. Call Les Classiques and ask for René Bergeron. Make up a name and say it's urgent."
When he comes on, what do I say?
"I don't think he will, but if he does, just hang up. And if he's not there, ask when he's expected. I'll call you back in 3 minutes." The infinitesimal jumps of his watch's second hand were agonizingly slow. Jason started dialing at 10 seconds, inserted the coins at 4, and spoke to the terrace's switchboard at -5. Marie picked up the phone the instant it rang.
It was a very short conversation. Monsieur Bergeron's on a fabric search in the Mediterranean. He left this morning and isn't expected back for several weeks.
I may have just seen him 800 miles from the Mediterranean. Lavier's dead.
Oh my God. What are you going to do?
Talk to a man I think I knew. If he's got a brain in his head, he'll listen. He's marked for extinction.
D'Anjou?
Delta, I'd know your voice anywhere.
Delta. D'Anjou knew. Jacqueline Lavier's dead. Carlos killed her.
She called me 2 hours ago. She's joining Monsieur Bergeron.
What, on a fabric search in the Mediterranean? Interrupted Jason. Did she sound in control?
She was upset, and you know why. You've done a remarkable job here, Delta, or Kane, or whatever you call yourself now. It's why she's going away for a while.
It's why she's dead. You're next. Ring the Church of the Blessed Sacrament in Neuilly-sur-Seine. Ask about the woman who killed herself in a confessional. I'll call you back. Bourne hung up and left the box, looking for a cab. He made the next call from the Place Vendôme 14 minutes later, his strategy clear. D'Anjou had to be convinced that the men following him were his executioners, and they must not know that another was following them.
A middle-aged woman with silver and white hair, expensive clothes, and a Saint Laurent bag, said D'Anjou. I've just described 10,000 Parisiennes.
The bag wasn't hers. She carried a white leather one. The papers in it will identify her as someone else. It's a method Carlos used in 5 kills I can name. And in 3 or 4 weeks, there'll be a plane crash or a shipwreck, bodies charred beyond recognition or simply gone, but the identities of the dead established. Lavier and Bergeron. But by then, you'll be long buried.
And you?
According to the plan, I'll be dead, too. They expect to take me through you, as I'm sure you know. That's what I want to talk about.
Paris isn't Tamquan, Delta. We work for different employers now. But for the sake of what you did there, take my advice and get out of Paris.
Tamquan, Medusa. Kane is for Charlie, and Delta is for Kane. Stop it. Concentrate on what is. And that's a man who can give you answers. Bourne used the only weapon he had left. Whom do you call for instructions now that Parc Monceau is out? Tension vibrated in D'Anjou's silence. When he replied, it was a whisper.
What did you say?
That's why Lavier was killed. She went to Parc Monceau and died for it. So will you. Carlos will use you to trap me, then kill you. The silence was longer than before. Then D'Anjou asked,
What do you want from me?
Information.
What information?
You'll lie if I ask you now. But when I see you, you'll tell me the truth.
With a wire around my throat?
In the middle of a crowd, in daylight, an hour from now, outside the Louvre, at the taxi stand by the steps.
You can't expect me to discuss my employer.
Not yours. Mine.
Treadstone?
D'Anjou had the answer. Stay calm.
71, completed Jason. And in return, I'll tell you something that may let you live. You've got a number to call, haven't you? Ring and say I contacted you. Want a meeting outside the Louvre in an hour. The truth.
You're baiting your own trap?
They have my photo. Better a controlled situation than one where there's no control at all, said Bourne. An hour, outside the Louvre.
Bourne waited in the taxi down the street from Lake Classique, an American tourist whose wife was shopping in the haute couture quarter. He had found Carlos's surveillance, a black saloon with a rubber-capped antenna. He would feel more secure if that radio were shorted out, but there was no way to do it. The alternative was misinformation. Sometime during the next 45 minutes, Jason would do his best to ensure the wrong message was sent over that radio. Philippe d'Anjou walked onto the pavement, a grey Homburg covering his grey hair. His glance swept the street, telling Bourne that he had relayed his information and knew there were men ready to follow him. A taxi drew up. D'Anjou spoke to the driver and climbed in. Across the street, the antenna rose and the saloon pulled out after the taxi. Jason leaned forward to his driver.
I forgot, he said irritably. It was the Louvre this morning, shopping this afternoon. Take me to the Louvre, will you?
Twice during the short ride, Jason's taxi passed the black saloon and was repassed by it, which gave Bourne the opportunity to see what he needed to. The man beside the driver spoke repeatedly into the radio microphone. Others were closing in on the execution ground. They reached the enormous entrance of the Louvre.
Pull in behind those other taxis, said Jason.
But they wait for fares, monsieur. I will take you to the...
Just do it.
Bourne dropped 50 francs over the seat, and the driver swerved into the line. The black saloon was 20 yards to his right. The passenger turned to look out of the left rear window. Jason followed his gaze and saw the grey car that had been at Neuilly-sur-Seine. Its antenna was retracting into its base, as was the black saloon's. Contact made. Visual sighting confirmed. 4 men. Bourne checked the crowds at the museum entrance. D'Anjou was pacing cautiously by the large block of white granite on the left of the steps. Time to send the misinformation.
200 francs if you do exactly what I tell you, said Jason. Pull out and go to the end, then make 2 lefts and head back up the next lane.
The driver did it. Bourne pulled the automatic from his belt and checked the silencer.
Slow down, he said. That large gray car parked up ahead, the one pointing to the Seine exit. Go past it slowly.
Bourne slid over to the left of the seat and rolled down the window, keeping his head and weapon concealed.
When the taxi and saloon were parallel, he thrust both into view and fired, 5 spits, shattering the right rear window. The 2 men lurched to the floor, but they had seen him. "Get out of here!" yelled Bourne to his terrified driver, throwing 200 francs over the seat and wedging his felt hat against the rear window. The taxi shot towards the gates. Jason slid back across the seat, rolled out of the right door, and dived between 2 parked cars. Carlos's men were losing no time in pursuit. The driver raced after the taxi as his companion held the microphone, shouting orders to the other sedan. The gray car passed within feet of Jason. The expressions on the men's faces said they had Cain in their sights and would earn their pay in minutes. Bourne had only moments, too. D'Anjou had played his role and was expendable. He ran towards the black saloon. Its former occupants were converging on Philippe d'Anjou. 1 accurate shot from either, and he would be dead. Treadstone gone with him. Jason ran faster, gripping the heavy automatic inside his coat. "Medusa!" he roared. "Medusa! Medusa!" D'Anjou's head snapped up, shock on his face. One of the killers spun round, his weapon leveled at Jason, while his companion continued towards d'Anjou. Bourne dived and fired in midair. The man closing on d'Anjou collapsed on the cobblestones. 2 spits exploded over Jason's head, the bullets hitting metal behind him. He rolled left, his gun again steady, and pulled the trigger twice. The other hunter screamed, blood spreading across his face as he fell. People screamed. Parents threw themselves over children. Others ran for the shelter of the Louvre. Bourne got up, looking for d'Anjou. The older man had lunged behind the granite block and was now crawling out of his sanctuary.
Jason raced through the panicked crowd, shoving the gun into his belt, towards the man who could give him the answers. "Let's get out of here," he said. "Others will be back looking for us. Come on." A patch of black caught the corner of his eye. He spun instinctively, shoving Donjou back down as 4 rapid shots came from a dark figure standing by the taxi rank. Wide shoulders, tapered waist enhanced by a form-fitting black suit, dark face encased in a white silk scarf below the narrow-brimmed black hat. Carlos. Blurred images from the past converged with the present. The doors of Bourne's mind opened and closed. The thundering pain returned to his temples. He started after the man in the black suit. Was it Bergeron? Or... No time. He feinted left and dived right, out of the line of fire. Bullets splattered into stone. From under a stationary car, Jason saw the figure in black racing away. He crawled out and ran back towards the Louvre. Philippe Donjou came cautiously into view.
Tam Quan's never far away, it seems. Where shall we go, Delta? We can't stay here.
They sat in a crowded café on Rue Visage, a back street in Montmartre. Donjou sipped his double brandy pensively.
I shall return to Asia, he said. France was never very good for me. Now it's deadly.
You may not have to, said Bourne, swallowing whiskey. Tell me what I want to know, and I'll give you Carlos's identity.
Bergeron? Donjou asked quietly. Whenever we talk, I wonder, but each time I reject the idea. Perhaps because I've learned more about Carlos from René than anyone else. He talks too much about him.
The ego speaking through the assumed second party?
It's inconsistent with the extraordinary precautions Carlos takes. I'm not sure, but I doubt it's Bergeron.
Donjou smiled.
Don't worry, I'll tell you what I can anyway. If it helps you to take Carlos, obviously the world will be safer for me. Ask your questions.
Villier's haggard face came to Bourne's mind. He had promised himself to learn what he could for the general. There would be no other opportunity. Where does Villier's wife fit in?
Donjou's eyebrows arched. Angelique? He asked. Have you seen her closely? The skin?
Close enough. She's very tanned.
The Riviera, the Greek islands, Stade. But the tan would be there in any event. Angelique Villiers is Hispanic. Venezuelan, to be precise.
Sanchez, whispered Bourne.
Ilich Ramirez Sanchez. Yes. Carlos's cousin. His lover since she was 14. The rumor is that, beyond himself, she's the only person on Earth he cares about. Villiers is the drone, Carlos's wire into the most sensitive areas of the government, including the files on Carlos himself.
Brilliant, said Jason flatly. He leaned forward, changing direction abruptly. Treadstone, he said. Tell me all Carlos knows about Treadstone.
I don't think I can do that. I hear things, piece things together, but I was never told much. I was only brought in because of my knowledge of Medusa. When I saw you, I knew you'd made another deal with the Americans. The monk confirmed it before he died. That much I was told. That you agreed to become the mythical Cain to draw out Carlos.
Rays of his own personal sunlight burst into Jason's mind. In the distance, doors were opening. Light where before there had been only darkness. Then the Americans are... Bourne did not finish the statement, hoping that Donjou would do it for him.
Yes, said the Medusan. Treadstone 71, created by the same man who built Medusa. David Abbott.
The monk, said Jason instinctively. Another door ajar.
Donjou leaned forward. They thought you were American intelligence, possibly military. I told Bergeron that was impossible, but I'm not sure he was convinced. I think you did it to clean a slate somewhere.
You may be right, said Jason, cool winds of release blowing into the mists. Is there anything else you can tell me? Do they know the precise location of Treadstone?
Yes. 140 East 71st Street. And as you obviously know, the Americans think you turned, or want Carlos to believe they think so, said Danjou. And I'm not sure it's relevant, but they know you're not Jason Bourne. What? March 25th. It's only 2 days away, and Carlos wants your corpse on that day. Don't you remember, Delta? On March 25th, 1968, you executed Jason Bourne at Tam Quan.
Marie opened the door, and for a moment Bourne stood looking at her, then walked in and closed the door. She came to him, and they held each other, the embrace saying more than words.
You were right,
he whispered finally, lips against her hair.
I'm not Kane. Because there is no Kane.
As Bourne told her it all, he could see in her the relief he had felt himself. A light in her eyes, a muted throbbing in her neck, sheer joy bursting from her throat.
Jason,
she cried, taking his face in her hands.
It's everything we knew, everything we felt.
Not quite everything, he said. Jason Bourne's the name I was given, but it's not mine. Apparently I killed him in a place called Tam Quan. Marie slid her hands down to his shoulders.
There must have been a reason. All that matters now is that you reach Treadstone. Even if they really think you've turned, you can explain.
Bourne took off his coat and put his gun in the desk drawer, his eyes straying to the mirror, to the face that had no name.
How?
He asked. This is Jason Bourne, except I know that's not my name. Sorry, gentlemen, I gather we've got an agreement, but I don't remember what it is. They'll think, we've got a prime bastard here, let's put him away for a couple of decades. He not only took us, but he could be one hell of an embarrassment. Bourne turned to Marie. I'm not kidding. What do I say?
The truth,
she answered.
Wire Washburn. He kept detailed records.
He may not answer. I sent him over $1 million, and he's a drunk. How long can he live with that? More to the point, how long will those pirates let him live if they find out?
You can prove you were there for 5 months, ill and isolated.
How can Treadstone be sure? From their viewpoint, I'm a walking encyclopedia of official secrets. I want to be careful, that's all, said Bourne abrasively. He stopped, shook his head. With each step, I've been afraid. Now I'm more frightened than ever. Who am I? What have I left back there? Has that occurred to you?
In all its ramifications, my darling,
said Marie.
But I don't think that can stop us.
The attaché at the American Embassy on Avenue Gabrielle walked into the first secretary's office and closed the door, a red-bordered index card in his hand. The man at the desk looked up. You're sure it's him? He used the keywords, said the attaché, handing over the card. Here's the flag. If that's accurate, I'd say he's genuine. The first secretary studied the card. When did he mention Treadstone? After I convinced him that he wasn't going to talk with anyone in intelligence until he gave me a damn good reason. Didn't he say there was a flag out for him?
No. He did say DC's been looking for him for 6 months. He also told me to relay the code words Delta, Kane, and Medusa. The first two are on the flag. I don't know what Medusa means.
I don't know what any of it means, said the first secretary, except that my orders are to hightail it down to communications and get a sterile patch to a spook named Conklin. What's the schedule? I don't suppose he gave you a telephone number.
He wanted to call back in 15 minutes, but I told him an hour or so. That'd make it past 5 o'clock, so we could gain another couple by my being out to dinner.
We can't risk losing him. I'll let Conklin set up the game plan. He's the control on this. Alexander Conklin sat in his office in Langley and listened to the embassy man. It was Delta. The Medusa reference was proof. The bastard was playing the stranded agent, knowing his controls couldn't respond to the proper codes because the dead couldn't talk. His sheer nerve was awesome. Kill the control and use the kill to call off the hunt. Conklin had done it in the hills of Huangke, where a maniac was issuing orders that meant certain death for a dozen Medusans. But no prints had identified the sniper. There were prints at 71st Street, and Delta didn't know it. He pulled his mind back to the present. What are the arrangements?
Bourne wanted to call back in 15 minutes, but I instructed lower level to stall.
The embassy man was making sure a company executive realized his perspicacity. You did the right thing, Conklin said. We need time. When Bourne calls back, tell him Washington is flying over a Treadstone officer, and he's to keep away from the embassy, but check in with you every hour to confirm he's in safe territory. Ask him if he wants protection, and if so, where he wants to pick it up. But don't send anyone. When we next talk, I'll have a name and visual identification for one of our people. Beyond you, it's vital we don't involve the embassy, so your conversation shouldn't be logged. Conklin hung up, limped across to a filing cabinet, and unlocked the top drawer. Inside was a list of men who were no longer on a Washington payroll, but could be called on in emergencies. There was a reliable man in Paris. 3 minutes later, he had him on an unrecorded line and gave him a name and a brief sketch. Our man was bought off, said Conklin. We want whatever information we can get, which is why I'm on my way over. But it's secondary to taking him out. It's got to be airtight. He's one of the best. I'd suggest support.
I've got a man worth 5 for hire.
Hire him. The first secretary in Paris is in communication with Bourne and may request protection for him. My ETA will be anywhere between 10 and 1 your time. I want to see Bourne an hour or so after that, and be back here by tomorrow. Conklin gave the remaining details. Everything was in motion, exactly as Delta would expect. The inheritors of Treadstone would go by the book, which was specific where collapse strategies were concerned. They were to be dissolved, cut off. He would listen to Delta's story, try to discern a genuine note or reasonable explanation, but he knew he would hear neither. Fragments of glass could not beam themselves across the Atlantic. He would give Delta 2 minutes to say whatever came to his facile tongue, and then pull the trigger. Why are they doing it? Said Jason, sitting down next to Marie in the packed cafe, having made the 5th telephone call. Why didn't they just tell me to come to the embassy? Order me.
The streets are watched. They told you that.
I accepted that until just now, when it struck me. Who by?
Carlos, obviously.
You and I know that. At least we can assume it. But they don't.
They could assume, too,
suggested Marie.
They might have spotted strange men in cars or standing around too long, too obviously.
Carlos is brighter than that. And there are lots of ways a vehicle could get quickly inside an embassy's gates. But they didn't even suggest it. Instead, they're stalling. God damn it, why?
They're waiting for the man from Washington?
Marie suggested. Where better to wait than the embassy? Bourne pushed back his chair. Something's wrong. Let's get out of here. It took Conklin 6 hours and 12 minutes to cross the Atlantic. In the morning, he would take the first Concorde out of Paris and be at Langley at 9. If anyone asked where he had spent the night, an accommodating major would supply a false answer. And the first secretary in Paris would be told that if he ever mentioned any contact with him, he'd be shipped to Tierra del Fuego. Conklin called the embassy. The first secretary was filled with a sense of accomplishment. Everything's on schedule, Conklin, he said, with no honorific mister. The company man was in Paris now, and turf was turf. Bourne's edgy. He kept asking why he wasn't to come in. When do you expect his next call? In about 15 minutes. Tell him the Treadstone officer has arrived. Conklin took the map from his pocket, already folded to the area, the route marked in blue. Say the rendezvous is for 1:30 at the Cimetière de Noblesse, on the road between Chevreuse and Rambouillet. Bourne hung up the phone and stared at it for a moment. Another door had partially opened. On the road to Rambouillet. Crosses and statuary. A place for conversations amid the lowering of caskets. 2 men moving between the mourners until they met and exchanged the words they had to. There was a face, out of focus. but it had a name. David Abbott, the monk. Jason blinked the mists away. He glanced at Marie, scanning the crowds on the metro platform, watching for someone watching him, and walked towards her. "Treadstone's here," he said. "I'm to meet him near Rambouillet, at a cemetery. I've been there before, met a man there. By naming it as the rendezvous, Treadstone's telling me he's genuine." She took his arm as they climbed the steps to the street.
I want to go with you.
"Sorry, I don't know what I'm going to find. And if it's not what I expect, I'll want someone on my side. Villiers trusts you. If I'm not back by daybreak, or haven't called explaining why, reach him. He's the one backup we've got." Marie nodded, accepting his logic.
How will you get to Rambouillet?
"We have a car, remember? I'll take you to the hotel, then head over to the garage." Bourne stepped into the garage lift and pressed the button for the third floor, his mind on a cemetery between Chevreuse and Rambouillet. If the images that had come to him were not completely distorted, it was enormous. Where within it was the meeting ground? He would get there by 1, leaving half an hour to look for a signal. Other things would come to him. The lift door opened. Was it right or left? Jason started left, then stopped, logic orienting him. The lift had been on his left when he'd entered. After he had parked, it had been to his right. He turned. A head ducked below the bonnet of a car in the second aisle on his right. Jason maintained his pace, considering this. Who had found him? And how? And then both answers were so obvious he felt like a fool. The clerk at the Auberge du Coin. And Carlos, thorough as always, had spread his army through the city, hunting for a specific black Renault. A painstaking search, but not impossible. He had to get out, and he needed transport, now. No taxi would drive a stranger to a cemetery outside Rambouillet at this hour, and it was no time to rely on stealing a car in the streets. Bourne stopped to light a cigarette, cupping his hands and angling his head to protect the flame. In the corner of his eye, he saw a shadow. The man was now behind the boot of a nearer car. Jason lunged silently between two cars, breaking his fall with his palms, and crawled quietly down the row, behind the man now. He crept forward and peered past a headlight. The heavy-set man was standing erect, evidently bewildered, for he moved hesitantly towards the Renault, squinting to see beyond the windscreen. When he saw no one, he gasped and began to race towards the exit ramp. Jason sprang up, hurled himself at the man's back, and threw him to the floor. He hammerlocked the thick neck, the fingers of his left hand pressed into the man's eyes. "You have exactly 5 seconds to tell me who's outside," he said. "Now!"
A man! One man, that's all!
Bourne dug his fingers deeper. "Where?"
In a car!
Spat the man.
Parked across the street. You're choking me! Blinding me!
"Not yet. What kind of car?"
Foreign! Please! My eyes! Green! Blue, very dark!
"You're Carlos's man, aren't you?"
I don't know any Carlos. We call a man. There is a number.
"What number? Have you called?" Bourne dug his fingers deeper. "Tell me!"
No! When? I've just seen you.
He gabbled the number, and Jason memorized it.
My God, I can't see!
"Yes, you can. Get up!" Jason pulled him to his feet and pushed him to the Renault. Moments later, it careered down the exit ramp towards the pay booth. Jason, his gun pressed against the driver's bruised neck, shoved a note and his ticket out of the window, and the Renault sped out, making a screeching U-turn in the street, and came to rest in front of a dark green Chevrolet. "Jules, qu'est-ce qui se passe?" A figure loomed in the open window. Bourne raised his automatic, pointing it at the man's face. "Take 2 steps back," he said, "and then stand still." He tapped the head of the man named Jules. "Get out, slowly."
We were only to follow you and report your whereabouts,
protested Jules, stepping out. "You'll do better than that," said Bourne, getting out of the Renault. "You're going to drive me. In your car, both of you." 5 miles outside Paris, he ordered them out again, on a dark D-class road. There had been no buildings or telephones for the past 3 miles. Bourne had reached the cemetery well before 1, the Chevrolet faster than the decrepit Renault, and parked out of sight several hundred yards beyond it. Now he walked between the graves in a cold, quiet March rain, letting his mind fall free. Rain. A sudden rain, cascading down white marble columns, a miniature replica of an ancient treasure. Crowds of mourners snapping umbrellas. And two men coming together, umbrellas touching. Quiet apologies muttered as a long brown envelope changed hands. On the other side of the hill, near the gates, someone's scaled-down version of the Parthenon. That was where the umbrellas had touched. He started running back up the path. There was a torch beam at the bottom of the hill, intermittently swinging back at the gates. Bourne slowed to a walk, wishing he had remembered to bring a torch himself. The light was moving in short vertical strokes now, as if in emphasis, as if the man holding it were speaking to another. Jason crept forward, low to the ground, until he could see more clearly. There were two men, one holding the torch, the other a short-barreled rifle. A very odd weapon for an officer of record sent by Washington. As the light washed the side of the mausoleum, the figure with the rifle retreated behind a column, 20 feet from the man holding the torch. That deadly weapon would not be used on Bourne. He slipped from grave to grave, statue to statue, until he was within 15 feet of the mausoleum. The gunman was standing under the portico to avoid the rain, fondling his rifle. Bourne crept silently within 6 feet of him and sprang, one hand grabbing the barrel of the rifle, the other the man's head. The head snapped back against the marble. The man went limp, Jason supporting him silently to the ground. He searched him, removing a .357 Magnum automatic, a razor-sharp scaling knife, and a .22 revolver from an ankle holster. Nothing remotely government issue. This was a hired killer. Bourne threw the weapons far into the shadowed grass, grabbed the man's right hand and bent the fingers back until he heard the cracks. He did the same with the left. Now, neither hand could be used as a weapon. Jason stood up and edged his face around the column. The Treadstone officer had taken a tentative step towards the gate, as though he might have heard something, and Bourne saw he walked with a cane. He melted back behind the nearest gravestone and glanced at his watch. 1:27. Hugging the ground until he was out of sight, he hurried back to the top of the hill and stood for a moment, getting his breath back, then reached into his pocket for a book of matches. Protecting it from the rain, he tore off a match and struck it. "Treadstone," he said, loud enough to be heard from below. "Delta." Jason started downhill again, his hand on his automatic, and walked onto the grass in front of the white mausoleum. The man from Treadstone limped towards him, then stopped, raising his flashlight, making Bourne squint and turn his head away. "It's been a long time," said the cripple, lowering the light. "The name's Conklin, in case you'd forgotten." "Thank you. I had. It's only one of the things I've forgotten. That's what we have to talk about. I was wounded, and the wounds caused a severe dislocation, a total memory loss. I spent 5 months on an island in the Mediterranean, not knowing who I was or where I came from. There's a doctor, an Englishman named Washburn, who kept medical records. He can verify it." "I'm sure he can," nodded Conklin. "Christ, you paid enough. The Gemeinschaft transferred 3 million Swiss francs to Marseille for collection, courtesy of the Treadstone budget. Thanks for the name." "I didn't know. Treadstone didn't exist for me." "Oh, yes, you lost your memory. What was the word? Dislocation? You located yourself to the bank, all right, where you knew exactly what to do," continued Conklin. "In and out, 7 million francs gone, along with 4 men. And then a female financial whiz just happened along to tell you how to squirrel away the lot. Will you listen? Those men were trying to kill me. Beyond that, I don't know what you're talking about. Images, names come to me at times, but I can't place them. God damn you, I'm an amnesiac. One of those names wouldn't be Carlos, would it? You know it is. That's the point. You know much more than I do. I can recite 1,000 facts about Carlos, but I don't know why.
A man told me Treadstone put out word that I'd turned. You thought that because you didn't hear from me. But I couldn't reach you because I didn't know who you were. Or the monk, I suppose. Or Gordon Webb, Conklin said quietly.
Bourne felt the jolt in his chest, the pain through his temples.
Almanac to Delta, abandoned.
Gordon. Jason heard his own voice, but it was far away. He closed his eyes and tried to push the mists away. When he opened them, Conklin had a gun aimed at his head.
I don't know how you did it, but you did. You got back to New York and butchered 5 people, including your own brother. Kane, alive.
I'm not Kane. He never was.
So, you do know. I swore to myself I'd hear what you came up with. Well, I've heard it, and it stinks. The techs have prints, third and index fingers, right hand. You were there, and you butchered them.
No, you're wrong. If what you're saying happened on 71st Street, it was Carlos. He knows. A residence on 71st Street, number 140.
Conklin's loathing was visible.
Only 8 people knew that address before last Friday. If Carlos found it, you're the only one who could have told him.
His left hand gripped the cane, steadying his crippled foot. It was a prelude to firing.
Don't!
Shouted Bourne, right foot lashing at the wrist that held the gun. Conklin fell, firing wildly in the air. Jason spun around and down, hammering his left foot at the weapon. It flew out of the other man's hand into the foliage. Conklin rolled, looking at the mausoleum, expecting an explosion that would blow his attacker into the air. Nothing. He rolled again, his eyes focused on someone else. Bourne dived diagonally as 4 gunshots came in rapid succession, pulling the automatic from his belt. He saw a silhouette rising above a gravestone and fired twice. The man collapsed. Conklin was thrashing on the wet grass, feeling for his gun. Bourne raced over and knelt, holding his automatic to Conklin's skull. "Your hired shotgun's out of it," he said. "Who was the other?"
A better man than you, spat Conklin. They all are. They never turned.
No matter what I say, you won't believe me. You don't want to believe me.
Because I know what you are and what you did. After Phnom Penh, everybody lost out there, but you thought you were special. Then in Medusa, no rules for Delta. The animal just wanted to kill. So kill me. But when I don't come back, they'll come after you, and they won't stop until they get you. Go on, shoot!
Conklin was shouting, but Bourne could hardly hear him for the pain hammering at his temples. Phnom Penh, death in the skies, from the skies, death of the young. He blinked, trying to force his mind back to him. Conklin had broken away and was hobbling towards the gates. Bourne raised his automatic. A split second, and his enemy would be dead. He could not pull the trigger. He lowered the gun, standing helpless as Conklin climbed into his car.
Dear God, what happened?
Asked Marie. It was a trap, he said, heading to the phone. They're convinced I turned, and they think you're part of it. They say I flew into New York last week and killed 5 people, among them my brother. Jason closed his eyes briefly. I had a brother. I can't think about it now, he said, dialing. Carlos engineered this, down to the last fragment of a fingerprint.
Who were you calling?
Villiers. We're going to take his wife. Breaker.
God damn it, why doesn't he answer?
It's 3 a.m. He's probably...
General, is that you? Jason asked. The voice on the line was oddly quiet.
Yes. I apologize for the delay. I've been upstairs with my wife.
That's who I'm calling about. I have to see her. Talk to her.
I'm afraid that's not possible. I've killed her.
Jason stared at the wall. Why? He said quietly. I thought you understood.
I tried, but I could not help myself. I kept looking at her, seeing the son she did not bear killed by the pig that was her mentor. I think she saw the outrage in my eyes.
The general paused.
Between our beds is a nightstand with a gun in the drawer. I opened the drawer for a book of matches and walked back to my chair, leaving it open, the gun in view. I said, "Why did you do it?" Then I called her a whore. She put both hands into the drawer and took out the gun. I did not stop her. I had to hear the words from her own lips. What I heard will go to my grave with me. The chapter is closed. My life over with a telephone call.
No, Jason shouted. Don't settle for Carlos's whore. Get Carlos. God damn you, what about your son?
Leave him in peace. Leave me in peace. It's over.
It's not. Give me a moment. That's all I ask.
The images in Jason's mind raced furiously. He could feel Marie's hand on his arm, anchoring him to reality.
Did anyone hear the gunshot?
There was none. I strangled her. Why persist, Monsieur Bourne? You accomplish nothing.
I will if I can get you to listen. Get Carlos. How many times do I have to say it? He's the one you want, the one I need.
I would like to help you, but there's no way I can.
There is.
Meaning and purpose came together.
Reverse the trap. You didn't kill your wife. I did.
Parc Monceau was quiet, most of the windows dark. Villiers had agreed to leave the basement door unlatched. But first there were Carlos's watchers to find. The black saloon from the Louvre, containing the same two men, was 50 feet down the street, with a clear view of Villiers' house. But were they the only ones? Bourne needed a diversion, alarming enough to flesh out any others. Fire. Away from Villiers' house, yet close enough to startle them. Bourne crept into the intersecting street, and in the nearest doorway took off his shirt, ripping the cloth from collar to waist. He put his jacket and coat on again, and peered into the night. There was a motorbike chained to a wrought iron gate, its petrol tank a metal bubble between handlebars and seat. Jason put his hand on the fuel cap. It unscrewed easily. Better yet, the opening was relatively wide, the petrol level nearly full. He replaced the cap. Another piece of equipment was needed before he doused his shirt. He found a partially dislodged cobble at the next corner, pried it loose along with a smaller fragment, and went back to the motorbike. Minutes later, Bourne pulled the drenched shirt out of the tank and wrapped it around the cobblestone, tying the sleeves firmly. He was ready. 3 car lengths behind the saloon, directly across from Jason, was a white stone house where light spilled from a bay window, obviously a dining room. He could see chairs and a long table. That would do. First, Bourne threw the smaller stone as far as he could ahead of the saloon. The impact echoed through the street, followed by a series of cracks as it clattered across a car bonnet and dropped to the pavement. The saloon's passenger leapt out, gun in hand. The driver switched on the headlights. The beams bounced back off the car in front. Jason raced across the street, crouched behind a boot, holding the shirt-wrapped brick by the end of a sleeve, then struck a cluster of matches beneath it. The cloth burst instantly into flame. He hurled his missile towards the bay window, then disappeared around the side of the building as it hit. The crash of shattering glass woke the street. Windows lit up nearby, then further away. As fire leapt up into the drapes, shouts erupted, and the chaos grew. The door of the burning house was yanked open, and an elderly man and woman ran out. Other doors opened, other figures emerged, racing towards the scene. Jason, one more figure in the crowd, looked for Carlos's soldiers. There were 5 men huddled by the saloon now, talking rapidly. Sirens approached. The watchers were alarmed. Perhaps there were police records to consider. Agreement was reached. One man crossed the road to Villiers' side, and the others climbed into the saloon, which slid out of its parking place and drove off as a fire engine careered up the street. Bourne broke into a loping run, like the people heading towards the fire, melding into the surrounding pattern, only the direction in conflict. The watcher was standing in front of the gate to a basement entrance halfway between the corner and Villiers' house, glancing back and forth, perhaps alarmed at being alone on patrol. As Jason passed him, he pivoted on his left foot, his right lashing at the man's midriff, plummeting him down into the area, and leapt after him, his knuckles smashing into the man's throat. Carlos's soldier went limp. He would not regain consciousness until long after someone removed him to a hospital. Inside the house, Bourne climbed to the second floor, rehearsing his story. He had to bring in the assassin, or he and Marie were dead. Villiers had to understand this, and there was so little time to explain. A contract with a group of honorable men who were after Carlos. That was all Villiers had to know. He could not be told he was dealing with an amnesiac. The bedroom was filled with shadows, the only light a bedside lamp. Villiers was sitting on a chair at the foot of the bed, on which Angelique Villiers sprawled, bronzed head on the pillow, her eyes bulging, her throat swollen, the flesh a reddish purple. Her body was still contorted in furious struggle, long legs stretched out, negligee torn. Villiers looked at Bourne. "What happened outside?" he asked dully. 5 men were watching your house. I started a fire. All but one left. I took him out." "You're resourceful, Monsieur Bourne." "I'm resourceful," agreed Jason. "But if Carlos puts it together, and I think he will, he'll send someone here. When that man finds you and her, he'll kill you. Your wife was Carlos's cousin, his lover since she was 14. "I cannot kill her twice. I beg you, leave. What you've told me gives me the courage to face Almighty God." "You've written yourself out then," said Jason, noticing the bulge of a gun in the old man's pocket. "Oh, that's perfect, General. Carlos himself couldn't come up with anything better. What if I told why you really killed her?"
"From what she said, you're running from more than Carlos. You are not a man in whom much trust is placed."
"You trusted me on the road to Nanterre. You said because I gave you your life. I'm trying to give it to you again. I'm not being noble. Your staying alive is the only way I can stay alive." The old soldier looked up.
"Why?"
"I told you I wanted Carlos because something necessary was taken from me, and because of him. That's not the whole truth. There are other people involved, and something I can't explain made them think I made a pact with Carlos. They have men everywhere, with orders to execute me on sight. You're right. I'm running from more than Carlos."
"There's nothing to prevent me from making a call on your behalf. I owe you that."
"What are you going to say? I know Jason Bourne has no pact with Carlos because he exposed my wife as Carlos's mistress and I strangled her? I'm about to call the Sûreté and confess, although of course I won't tell them why. Is that it, General? Fine. Carlos wins it all. You lose, your son loses." The old man stared silently at Bourne, the fundamental contradiction clear to him.
"Do not do this. I'm telling you, do not do this."
"You're telling me? The little old man with the big brass buttons is issuing a command? I don't take orders from men like you. All you've got is wind." Villiers shot out of the chair, his whole body trembling. "No more!" Grimacing in pain, he pulled out his gun.
"I've killed many men in my time. I don't want to kill you, but I will if you disregard my wishes. Leave this house!"
Jason took a step forward, the first movement he'd made since entering the room. The gun shook, but the hand that held it had spent a lifetime gripping steel. It would be steady when the instant came. That was the risk he had to take. Without Villiers, there was nothing. Jason suddenly shouted, "Go on! Fire! Take your orders from Carlos! You're a soldier! Obey your orders!" The trembling in Villiers' hand increased as the gun rose, leveled at Bourne's head. And then Jason heard the old man whisper,
"Vous êtes soldat. Arrêtez." Someone said that to me recently. Someone dear to you.
Villiers spoke quietly.
She shamed an old warrior into remembering who he was. Had been.
He lowered the gun, suddenly calm.
What would you have me do? Jason breathed again. Force Carlos into coming after me. Can you get me out of the country? My name and description are on every border check in Europe. There are ways. The brevet will do as I ask. Okay. That aide of yours. Do you trust him? Really trust him? With my life. With another's? One you correctly said was dear to me. Would you have him take her into the country where she'll be safe until I come back? What happens if you don't? Bourne said, I'll have time on the plane. I'll write out everything that's happened. Everything I remember. Send it to you, and you'll decide. With her. Protect her. You have my word. She will not be harmed. Villiers threw the gun on the bed. To practicalities, my young wolfpack, he said. What's this strategy of yours? To begin with, you're in a state of collapse. A man broke into your house during the fire and knocked you out. When you came to, you found your wife dead, a note by her body. It's what's in the note that's driven you out of your mind. What would that be? Asked the old soldier cautiously. The truth you can never reveal. What she was to Carlos, said Jason. The note included a telephone number you could ring to confirm it, and to say there's another message, to Carlos. I'll write it for you. He'll send a relay for it. Bourne looked over at the dead woman. Do you have any rubbing alcohol? Perfume will do. Also a towel. What are you going to do? Put my hands where yours were, just in case. While I'm doing that, call whoever you have to call to get me out. I have a British passport identifying me as George Washburn, and there's a 7 a.m. flight, Air France to Kennedy. I have to be on my way before you call anyone. I can delay until then, I imagine. You'll be on it, with pre-clearance both ends on a NATO accommodation. You're part of an Anglo-American negotiating team. It's not unusual. The old man paused. Why New York? And what makes you sure Carlos will follow? I have to prove Carlos knew a building there. Jason looked again at the dead woman on the bed. And he'll come because I've killed the one person on Earth he cares about. He'll think maybe he isolated me too successfully. Maybe I'm irrational. An irrational man can be taken out. Bourne put down the pen and studied the words he had written. For a broken, bewildered old man to repeat over the telephone to a relay, who would demand the paper and give it to Carlos. I killed your whore, and I'll come back for you. There are 71 streets in the jungle, but there was a path you missed, a safe you did not know about. In it are documents that will set me free. Did you think I'd become Cain without that final protection? It seems right that on the date of Bourne's death, Cain picks up the papers that guarantee him a long life. You marked Cain. Now I mark you. Delta. Early light broke over the church in Levallois-Perret in northwest Paris. A few women returning from night shifts trudged in and out of the bronze doors, attending to their devotions before their sleep. Shabbily dressed men with bottles in their pockets also drifted towards the warmth of the church. One old man was in a hurry. It was an odd hour to seek confession, but he went directly to the first booth and slipped inside. Angelus Domini. Did you bring it? The whisper demanded, trembling with rage. Yes, he thrust it in my hand, weeping. He'd burnt Cain's note to him, said he didn't believe a word of it, would deny it all. The old man shoved the paper under the curtain. How? Why? There was anguish in the assassin's voice. He must have followed Lavier to Parc Monceau, then Neuilly. I told you I saw him there. Why? He's gone mad. Both sides want his corpse, and he can't know why. He may not even be sure who he is any longer. He knows, said Carlos in a quiet fury. By signing Delta, he's telling me he knows. What are these papers he writes of? In the old days, they were called final payments, to be used if no other avenues were open to the agent. It was not something you would have studied in Novgorod.
71 streets in the jungle, Carlos read, now icy calm. This time, the execution will take place as scheduled. I'll peel his face away. The Americans can give his body whatever name they care to. The blue-striped telephone on Alexander Conklin's desk, his direct line to the computer rooms, rang. The CIA man lurched for it. He'd been in scrambler communication all night in a commandeered military jet, trying to undo the insanity of the past 24 hours. He was exhausted. "This is Computer Doc 12, said an efficient male voice. "One of the names you gave us, Washburn. A George P. Washburn was pre-cleared out of Paris and into New York on an Air France flight which landed at 10:37. Since the status was NATO diplomatic, we checked with State. There's no Washburn involved in any current NATO negotiations."
Then how the hell was he pre-cleared? Barked Conklin.
"A courtesy accommodation of the Brevet Militaire. It's one way to get a decent seat on an overbooked plane. Washburn's passport was British." There's a doctor, an Englishman named Washburn. It was Delta. But why New York? And who so influential in Paris would accommodate him?
Okay, I want this deleted.
"Understood, sir. Deleted, sir." Conklin hung up. Delta knew the name Washburn would be picked up sooner or later. Later, after he was inside the gates. He was telling what was left of Treadstone that he was dealing from strength. His connection inside the Brevet was proof of that. But no matter how much explosive information he possessed, no sane man walked back into a minefield surrounded by his enemies. No sane man. Conklin sat slowly forward in his chair, sifting folders until he found the one he was looking for. He opened it, almost afraid to see what he knew was there. Date of execution, 25th March. Conklin's eyes moved to the desk calendar. 24th March. "Oh, Christ," he whispered, reaching for the telephone. The call reached Dr. Morris Panoff in Bethesda's Naval Annex. Panoff was startled. Alex Conklin had been a patient for 5 years, until they agreed he'd adjusted as well as he was going to, which was not a lot. Whatever Conklin wanted had to be serious for him to call Bethesda rather than the office. "I need some fast answers, Mo," said Conklin, his voice strained. "A man may be running around ready to blow away ghosts. He's already killed real people, and I'm not sure he knows it. Help me."
If I can, go ahead.
"A man is placed in deep cover for a long time. The cover's negative and very visible, designed to draw out a target by persuading him that the decoy's a threat. Are you with me so far?"
So far,
said Panoff.
What's his environment been, and for how long?
"As brutal as you can imagine, for 3 years.
When will you damn fools learn? Even prisoners in the worst camps could be themselves."
Panoff stopped.
That's your point, isn't it?
"I'm not sure," answered the CIA man. "But could a man under these circumstances begin to believe he's the decoy?"
Of course he could. Probably would.
The doctor stopped again.
Wait a minute. I'm not confirming any blind diagnosis. Not for what you're leading up to.
"How do you know what I'm leading up to?" asked Conklin.
Because you're not very subtle. You're about to describe a case of paranoid schizophrenia with multiple personalities. Not just your man assuming the role of the decoy, but the decoy transferring his identity to the target. I'm not confirming anything remotely like that without an extensive examination.
"I'm not asking you to confirm anything. I just want to know if it's possible. For Christ's sake, Mo, he's running around killing people he claims he didn't know, but whom he worked with for years. He denies being where his fingerprints prove he was. He says images come to him, faces he can't place, names he doesn't know. Is it possible?" Panoff held his breath for a moment.
If your facts are accurate, yes. But there are many other possibilities.
"Thank you." Conklin paused. "A last question. Say there was a date that was significant to the decoy's dossier, and he knew it. Also a place where the strategy was conceived. If our man was in the vicinity of that place at that date, would he be drawn to it?"
It'd depend on who he was at the moment. If he was the target, he would. It would be a subconscious urge to kill the decoy. Everything in sight, but the main objective would be the decoy. Himself.
Alexander Conklin replaced the phone and closed his eyes. In Paris, he had wanted to kill Delta for the wrong reasons. He was dealing with a madman who must still die. Nobody could afford him any longer. Villiers sat opposite Marie Saint-Jacques in the Montmartre Café. His aide walked to a table 10 feet away, on guard. The general looked at Marie.
Why did you insist on my coming here? He wanted you out of Paris. I gave him my word.
I'm sorry, said Marie.
I don't want to be another burden for you. I want you to tell me where he's gone. He told you. He lied. I know when he tells the truth. We both listen for it. When I heard the radio reports, that description, so complete, even to the scar on his left temple, I knew he was going far away, where the description wouldn't mean much, where Carlos could be led to the people Jason had his agreement with. Am I right?
Villiers put down his glass.
I don't understand. Then I'll try to be clearer, said Marie. There was another report on the radio, as well as the one about you. 2 men were found dead in a cemetery near Rambouillet. One a known killer from Saint-Gervais, the other a former American intelligence officer. Jason was sent to that cemetery by the American embassy last night to meet a man flying over from Washington. They tried to kill him.
Good God, why?
Because they don't know what he's done or where he's been for a long time, and he can't tell them. He's a near-total amnesiac.
Marie paused.
He'll make sure they know where he's gone, and they'll kill him. He's walking into his own trap.
For several moments, Villiers was silent. Finally, he whispered,
Dear God, what have I done? He said he would write out everything that had happened, everything he remembered. I can't wait for that letter, mademoiselle. I must know all you can tell me. What can you do? Go to the American ambassador. Now, everything.
Marie Saint-Jacques slowly leaned back, her eyes far away.
He told me life began for him on an island called Ile de Port-Noir.
The Secretary of State walked angrily into the office of the Director of Consular Operations, the section dealing with clandestine activities, and slapped a yellow legal pad down on the desk. On the top page was a column of 6 names. Bourne, Delta, Medusa, Kane, Carlos, Treadstone. "What the hell is this?" he asked. The Director of Cons Op leaned over the desk.
I don't know, sir. Names, of course, an alphabetic code, the letter D, and a reference to Medusa. Well, that's still classified, but I've heard of it. And I suppose Carlos is the assassin, but I've never heard of Bourne or Kane or Treadstone.
"Come up to my office and listen to a tape of a telephone conversation I've just had with Paris, and you'll learn all about 'em," exploded the Secretary of State. "And killings, lying to foreign governments and our own intelligence units, with neither the knowledge nor the consent of the Department of State. We're flying over a Canadian who's wanted for murder, because if she's telling the truth, we've got our ass in a sling. I want to know what's been going on. Cancel everything. You're spending all day and night, if you have to, digging this out of the ground." It was past midnight when the director made the connection. The first secretary in Paris had given him Conklin's name, but Conklin had signed out of Langley, leaving no contact number. Moreover, his telephone logs for the past 2 days had been scratched. However, the director of Cons Op had learned one fact. Conklin had been attached to Medusa. He had demanded a readout of Conklin's logs for the past 5 weeks and sat in front of a screen for 2 hours. 86 logicals had been called, the word Treadstone mentioned. None had responded. Then the director went back to an army man he'd previously discounted because of his well-known antipathy to the CIA, whom Conklin had telephoned twice in 12 minutes a week ago. Brigadier General Irwin Arthur Crawford, in charge of Army intelligence databanks, former Commander Saigon, attached to covert operations still classified. Medusa. He used his direct line to dial the Brigadier's home, identified himself, and asked Crawford to call back and be put through verification concerning Treadstone. When he did, the director outlined his information. "Is this related to that business in New York a week ago?" he asked. "Elliot Stevens, Major Webb, and David Abbott? Well, the circumstances were, shall we say, considerably altered?"
Affirmative.
"I see. Bourne flew into New York yesterday morning."
We know. That is, Conklin and myself. We're the inheritors.
"You've been in touch with Conklin? He's checked out of Langley. There's no number where he can be reached."
I know that, too. With all due respect, tell the secretary to back off. We're dealing with a multiple schizophrenic. He could kill a dozen people with one explosion in his own head and not know why. That massacre was him. We have fingerprints, confirmed by the Bureau. Leave him to us. He's our problem.
"Where did you come up with the conclusion of multiple schizophrenia?"
Conklin spoke to a psychiatrist, described the history, and the doctor confirmed his suspicions.
"Based on what a third party thought?" asked the director incredulously. "No, General. You're not dealing with a schizophrenic, but an amnesiac. And when he tried to tell Conklin, Conklin wouldn't listen."
You're wrong. Conklin and I both knew Bourne and Medusa. He was as close to paranoid as anyone in the outfit. I tried to prevent his selection for Treadstone. I was right. I stand on that.
"You're not going to stand on anything. You're going to fall right on your iron ass. Because your man is bringing Carlos right to your goddamn door. That is, unless you kill Bourne first." Crawford's intake of breath was precisely what the director was afraid he might hear. "You can't reach Conklin, can you?" he asked. "He's gone under, made his own arrangements. And by now there are photographs in the hands of men even Conklin wouldn't recognize, ready to fire when the condemned man comes into view. Am I reading the scenario?"
You don't expect me to answer that,
said Crawford. "You don't have to. But you were right about one thing. This is your problem. The State Department can't afford to know you. Consider this call unlogged."
Understood.
"I'm sorry," said the director. "It all blows up sometimes. Incidentally, the Canadian woman's at the Pierre Hotel. We'll bring her down to Washington in the morning, after we work out what to do."
Wait.
Crawford's voice rose.
Can you get me clearance to see her? We have photographs, but they're 3 years old, and Bourne's changed drastically. It's why Conklin's on the scene. He's the only one who's seen him, but it was night and raining. She's been with him for weeks. She might recognize him before anyone else.
"I don't understand."
Among Bourne's talents is the ability to change his appearance. In Medusa, they used to call him a chameleon. That's why she can help. If she's with me and we find him, we can get him out of there.
"There? Are you telling me you know where he's going to be and when?" asked the director.
Yes, today. The date of his own execution.
Rock music blared from the radio as the cab edged east on 71st Street. Engines roared and cars lurched forward only to slam to sudden stops. New York's rush-hour traffic, the usual contradiction in terms. Bourne stared through his sunglasses. He had been here. He had glanced up at the roof gardens before, relating them to a garden beyond a pair of French doors in a complicated room in a tall, narrow brownstone. A brownstone with a flight of outside steps, each crisscrossed with black ridges that protected shoes going down from slipping on ice or snow, and triggered electronic devices inside. Bourne knew they were approaching that house. The echo in his chest accelerated. The morning sun bounced off the black door and the shiny brass, penetrating the lead-paned windows that glistened purplish blue, emphasizing the ornamental splendor of the glass, but not its resistance to heavy-caliber weapons. He felt that he had come back to a place that was a part of him. Not a home, but there was an overpowering sensation of return. He wanted to leap up the steps and hammer his fist against the door. Images welled up. Jarring sounds assaulted his ears. He was in a dark room, staring at a screen, at flashing images.
Who is he? Where is this street? Too late. You're dead. Methods of matching kills. Which are yours? Who did you meet there? No. Delta might do that, not Kane. Wipe away the past. You aren't Delta. You're Kane. Jason Bourne. Concentrate.
Sweat rolled down Bourne's face. His identity was in that house, and whether Carlos came after him or not, he had to find it. He glanced up. The driver was watching him in the mirror. "Migraine," said Jason curtly. "Drive round the block and back. I'm early for my appointment." The seizure was receding. He had to see the house again. He had all day to work, to refine his strategy for the night. But a second, calmer appraisal was in order now. 16 minutes later, whatever he had intended to study no longer mattered. A removal van had parked in front of the house. Men in overalls stood smoking and drinking coffee, and a man in a green jacket, the moving company's emblem on the left pocket, stood in the open doorway, clipboard in hand. Treadstone was being dismantled. Jason leaned forward, money in his hand, the pain gone. All was movement now. He had to reach Conklin. Conklin had to tell them to stop. His strategy was based on darkness, not now. "Hey, mister!" yelled the driver through the open window. Jason bent down. "What is it?" "I just wanted to say thanks. This makes my—" A spit over his shoulder, followed by a cough. Bourne stared at the stream of blood over the man's left ear, then dropped, spinning towards the curb. 2 more spits came in rapid succession, the first embedded in the side of the taxi, the second exploding asphalt. He was marked before the hunt had begun. Carlos or one of his men had taken the high ground, a window or rooftop from which the entire street could be observed. Yet that was crazy. The police would come, the street be blocked off, the trap aborted. And Carlos was not crazy. Nor did Bourne have the time to speculate. He had to get to that phone. Carlos was here, at the doors of Treadstone. It was his proof.
The CIA, sir, is fundamentally a fact-finding organization,
said the man on the line condescendingly.
The sort of activities you describe are blown out of proportion by films and misinformed writers.
"God damn it, just tell me where Conklin is," said Jason, cupping the mouthpiece in a crowded delicatessen. "It's an emergency."
His office already told you, sir. Mr. Conklin left yesterday afternoon and is expected back at the end of the week.
"Don't hang up." There was another way. He didn't like it, but there was nothing else. 6 minutes ago, I got out of a taxi on 71st Street, and someone shot at me. But the driver spoke to me, and I bent down to listen. The bullet's in his skull. There are probably 6 police cars on the scene by now. Check it out. There was a brief silence from Langley.
I'll follow it up. Where can I reach you?
I'll stay on the line. The waiting was intolerable. Then the man in Langley was on the line, anger replacing compromise.
The NYPD say there was no such incident on 71st Street. There are laws about calls like this, with strict penalties involved. Good day, sir.
Bourne stared at the dead phone in disbelief, then put it back on the hook, tempted to bolt. Instead, he walked calmly to the door, scanning the crowds on the pavement. Outside, he removed his overcoat, carrying it over his arm, replaced the sunglasses with his tortoise shells, and hurried across the intersection toward 71st Street. At the corner, he looked left. The taxi was gone, removed from the scene with surgical precision. Bourne turned quickly south. The chameleon had to change his outer skin. Marie Saint-Jacques faced Brigadier General Crawford angrily in the suite at the Pierre Hotel.
"You wouldn't listen," she accused. "Have you any idea what you've done to him?"
"I can only repeat, we didn't know what to listen for. The differences between appearance and reality were beyond our understanding."
"He's been trying to reconcile appearance and reality for 6 months, and all you could do was send men to kill him. God, you make me sick."
Marie stopped, shook her head, and continued more softly.
"I'll do whatever you ask. You know that. Can you reach Conklin?"
"I can stand on the step of that house until he has no choice but to reach me. Our main concern is to reach Delta. I've arranged for you to be in an unmarked car across from the house. You know him better than anyone. Perhaps you'll spot him. I pray you do.
Wait.
Marie approached the army man, her eyes riveted on his.
There's a better way. Put me on the steps of that house. He'll see me, get word to me.
I can't. If he's right, and Carlos has come after him, the risk's too great. He knows you by sight.
I'm willing to take that risk.
I'm not. May we go, please?
General Services Administration,
intoned a bored switchboard operator.
Mr. J. Petricelli, said Conklin, wiping sweat from his forehead as he stood by the window. Quickly, please.
Everybody's in a hurry.
The word shorted out, replaced by the hum of a ring.
Petricelli, Reclamation Invoice Division.
What are you people doing? Exploded the CIA man.
Right now, listening to some nut ask a stupid question.
My name's Conklin, CIA. 4-0 clearance. You know what that means? I just reached the dispatcher for a removal company in New York. He said he had an invoice signed by you to remove all the furniture from a brownstone on 71st Street. 140.
Yeah, I remember that one. What about it?
Who gave you the order? We removed our equipment last week, but we did not, repeat, not request any further activity.
Hold it,
said the bureaucrat.
That invoice came from Langley on a priority sheet. I got a copy.
There was a crackling of paper. Then Petricelli returned.
Here it is. Take up your beef with administrative controls.
Cancel it. Call the removal company and tell them to clear out. Now!
Get a priority requisition on my desk before 3 o'clock, and it may, just may, get processed tomorrow. Then we'll put everything back. We have procedures to follow, just like you.
I don't have time to explain. Just get those people out of there. Those are 4-0 orders. I'm telling you.
Conklin stopped, his eyes on the brownstone across the street, his thoughts suddenly paralyzed. A tall man in a black overcoat had walked up the steps, turned, and stood motionless in front of the open door. Crawford. What was he doing? He could break the trap.
Conklin? Conklin?
The voice floated out of the phone as the CIA man hung up. Conklin turned to a stocky man at the next window.
See that man in the black overcoat standing by the door? He asked. Get over there and tell him there's a cripple across the street wants to see him.
Bourne walked out of the second-hand clothing shop on 3rd Avenue, pausing to appraise his reflection in the window. The black woolen hat came halfway down his forehead. The army jacket was several sizes too large. The checked shirt, khaki trousers, and heavy work shoes all of a piece. He only had to find a walk to match the clothing. He saw a telephone box up the block and started walking, his legs automatically more rigid, feet pressing on the pavement, arms heavy, fingers slightly spaced, curved from years of abuse. A set, dull expression on his face would come later.
Belkin's moving in storage,
announced an operator.
My name's Johnson, said Jason. I have a problem, and I hope you can help me. I was on my way to the house of a friend who died recently to pick up something I'd lent him. When I got there, your van was in front of the house. I think your men may remove my property. Is there someone I might speak to?
That would be our dispatcher, sir. Murray Shumack. I'll connect you.
2 clicks preceded a long hum.
Shumack.
Bourne repeated his tale.
Of course, I can get a letter from my attorney, but the item has little or no value. A fishing rod with an old-fashioned reel, the kind that doesn't get tangled every 5 minutes.
Yeah, I know what you mean. Yeah, I fish out of Sheep's Head Bay. Yeah, they don't make them reels like they used to. Go see a guy named Dugan, the supervisor on the job. Tell him I said you could have it, but you'll have to sign for it. Good fishing.
Bourne walked to Lexington Avenue, where he found an army surplus store. He came out carrying 4 brown padded blankets and 6 canvas straps with metal buckles. In his pockets were 2 road flares. He slung the equipment over his shoulder and trudged up to 71st, the chameleon heading into the jungle. He was about to enter the place of his birth and was terrified at what he might find there. It was 10:48 when he reached the tree-lined block. Pedestrians strolled now. Cars swung round the removal van with only brief grimaces of irritation. Jason crossed the road, a weary, slow-witted laborer, and reached the steps as two muscular men, one black, one white, carried a harp out of the door. Bourne stopped and called out, his words halting, his dialect coarse. "Hey, where's Dugan?" "Where the hell you think?" replied the white. "Sitting in a fucking chair." "You ain't gonna lift nothing heavier than that clipboard, man," added the black. "He's an executive. Ain't that right, Joey? What you got there?" "Shumac sent me," said Jason. "He figured you needed this stuff." "Murray the Menace," laughed the black. "You new, man? I ain't seen you before. Take that shit up to the executive. He can allocate it. How about that, Joey? You like it?" "I love it, Pete. You're a regular dictionary." Bourne walked in, saw the winding staircase on the right, and the long, narrow corridor in front of him. Sunlight through French windows in the distance. He gripped the straps on his shoulder and tried to stop the trembling. Marie leaned forward. A stocky man had passed the brownstone a few minutes ago, slowing as he approached the general, obviously saying something to him. He had then continued down the block, and Crawford had followed. Conklin had been found. She focused the binoculars. A Belkins man was approaching the steps, blankets and straps over his shoulder. He stopped, talking to two other movers. His face was hidden from view, but there was something about the neck, the angle of the head. The man started up the steps, weary of his day before it had begun. Marie removed the binoculars. She was too anxious to see things that weren't there. Where was Crawford? He had promised to keep her informed of every move. She didn't trust him. Not any of them. She did not trust their intelligence, with a lowercase I. "I don't believe it," said Conklin, limping angrily across the room back to the window. He leaned against the sill, looking out, his teeth against the knuckle of his left index finger.
"You don't want to believe it, Alex," countered Crawford. "Your solution is so much easier. You're wrong. The fact that he's here proves you're wrong." Conklin was breathing heavily, his right hand trembling on his cane. "Maybe we—" He didn't finish, looking at Crawford helplessly. "Ought to let the solution stand?" asked the officer quietly. "You're tired, Alex. I don't think I heard that." "No." The CIA man shook his head, his face reflecting his disgust. "You didn't hear it, and I didn't say it. I just wish I knew where the hell to begin." "I do," said Crawford, opening the door. "Come in, please." The stocky man walked in, his eyes darting to the rifle leaning against the wall. "The exercise has been called off," Crawford said. "What exercise?" "I was hired to protect him." The gunman looked at Alex. "Good," said Crawford. "Now we have to know who else is out protecting him." The stocky man walked over to the rifle and picked it up. "I was hired on an individual basis. If others were also employed, I'm not aware of them." "You are!" shouted Conklin. "Who are they? Where are they?" "I have no idea, sir," the courteous gunman replied. "If my services are no longer required, I'll be leaving." "Can you reach them?" interrupted the brigadier. "We'll pay generously. A man's life is at stake." "So's mine," said the gunman. "Goodbye, gentlemen." "Jesus!" roared Alex. "What do we do?" "To start with, get rid of that removal company. I don't know what part it played in your strategy, but it's only a complication now." "I can't. I tried. I didn't have anything to do with it." "Then call in the police. Tell them to rope off the street." "Through the agency? This is domestic." "Then I will. Through the Pentagon. Clear the street, rope it off, bring in a truck with a public address system. Put her in it. Let her scream her head off. He'll come to her." "Do you know what you're saying?" asked Conklin. "Everything will be exposed. And what about Carlos? If he's really out there, you're opening the gates for him." "We didn't create Carlos. We created Kane, and we abused him. We owe him. Go and get the woman. I'll use the phone."
Bourne walked into the library with the sunlight streaming through the elegant French windows. All around him, objects too painful to look at. A long table where whiskey was poured. leather armchairs where men sat and talked, bookshelves that housed books, and other things that appeared with the touch of buttons. He saw the tubular bulge in the ceiling, and the darkness came, followed by flashes of light and images on a screen and voices shouting in his ears. "Hey, who the hell are you?" shouted a large red-faced man in an armchair, a clipboard on his knees. "You Dugan?" Bourne asked. "Shumack said you needed another man." "What for? I got 5 already, and this fucking place has hallways so tight you can't hardly get through 'em." "Yes, Shumack sent me, that's all I know. He told me to bring this stuff." Bourne let the blankets and straps fall to the floor. "He was heading out to Sheep's Head, back this afternoon." "Ah, great. He goes fishing and leaves me with the shit. Okay, get upstairs, top floor, and start with the single wood units. As heavy as you can carry, and no union bullshit." Bourne circled the landing on the first floor and climbed the narrow staircase to the second, pulled to another room, one that held both the comfort of solitude and the frustration of loneliness. He reached the top and stood for a moment. There were 3 doors, 2 on the left, 1 on the right. He started walking towards the second door on the left. That was where thoughts came in the darkness. Memories that haunted him, hurt him. Sunlight and the stench of the river, and machines screaming down from the sky. He opened the door. Darkness, but not complete. There was a thin line of sunlight where the window blind met the sill. He walked towards it. A scratch in the darkness. He spun, terrified at the tricks being played on his mind. But it was no trick. There was a diamond-like flash in the air, light bouncing off steel. A knife was slashing at his face.
"I would willingly see you die for what you've done," said Marie, staring at Conklin. "And that realization revolts me."
"Then there's nothing I can say to you," replied the CIA man. "He could have made other decisions."
"Could he? When? When that man tried to kill him in Marseille? When they hunted him in Zurich? In Paris? When you tried to kill him?"
Conklin returned her gaze, then turned to Crawford.
"What's happening?" "I'm not sure you want to hear. Clearances have to be obtained." "Look." The general suddenly bent to the window. "The truck's leaving." "Someone got through," said Conklin. "I'll find out who." He limped to the phone, selected one of the numbers scrawled on scraps of paper on the table, and dialed. "Give me Shumack." "Shumack, this is Conklin, Central Intelligence. Who gave you the word?"
The dispatcher's voice could be heard halfway across the room.
"Get off my back. We're on that job and we're gonna finish it."
Conklin slammed down the phone and dialed again, his eyes on another scrap of paper.
"Petrocelli, Reclamations," he commanded. "Petrocelli, Conklin again. That priority invoice from agency controls. Who signed it?"
Top cat who always signs them, McGivern.
Conklin's face turned white. He lowered the phone and turned to Crawford.
"The order to General Services was signed by a man who retired 2 weeks ago."
"Oh, God. The man carrying the blankets. The way he held his head. When his head hurts, he favors the right. It was Jason. He went inside."
Conklin turned back to the window. The black door across the street was closed. Bourne whipped his head back as the blade sliced his chin. He lashed his right foot out, catching his attacker's kneecap, then plunged his left heel into the man's groin. Carlos spun, and again the blade came out of the darkness, directed at his stomach. Jason sprang back, crossing his wrists, blocking the arm that was an extension of the knife. He twisted his fingers, vicing the forearm, and wrenched it diagonally up, then spiraled it down as Carlos plunged sideways, his arm pulled half out of its socket. Jason heard the knife clatter to the floor and lurched towards it, but not quickly enough. The steel toe of a shoe crashed into his head, and shockwaves bolted through him. He rolled, trying to focus through the shadows. A hand was caught in the sliver of light. He lunged at it and snapped it back, breaking the wrist. A scream, and the lethal spit of a gunshot, burying itself near Bourne's left shoulder. In agony, he sprang again, pummeling the killer into the wall. Carlos lurched away and fired 2 more wild shots. Jason dived, leveling his own gun, and fired. He heard the door crash shut. The killer had run out into the hall. Gasping, Bourne crawled towards the door. Instinct made him stay to the side and smash his fist into the wood. There was a burst of automatic gunfire, and the panel splintered. The instant it stopped, he raised his own weapon and fired diagonally through the hole. Get Carlos. He heard a rail break as the killer lurched downstairs. Carlos was hurt. Bourne wiped the blood from his throat, pulled open what was left of the door, and stepped out, gun leveled. As he made his way towards the staircase, he heard shouts below.
What the hell you doing, man? Pete!
2 spits filled the air.
Joey!
A single spit.
Jesus, mother of...
2 spits again, followed by a guttural cry.
I already got 5,
Dugan had said. He and 2 others were dead. So Carlos had brought 2 soldiers with him, and Bourne was cornered on the top floor. He veered towards a front window, creasing his shoulder to blunt the pain, jerked up the blind, and looked down. The removal van was gone. One of the soldiers must have driven it away. That left Carlos and 1 other. Bourne made his way to the first door on the left and stepped into a bedroom. Lamps, heavy furniture, pictures on the walls. He grabbed the nearest lamp, carried it out to the banisters, and hurled it down, stepping back as metal and glass crashed below. There was a burst of gunfire, bullets shredding the ceiling, cutting a path in the plaster. Jason screamed, let the scream fade to a cry, the cry to a wail, and then silence. He edged backwards and waited. Cautious footsteps approached. A shadow appeared on the wall. Bourne sprang out of his recess and fired 4 shots. The man on the stairs spun, roaring, then his neck arched and his body plummeted down until it was still, sprawled face up across the bottom 3 steps, in his hands an automatic machine gun. Jason ran down, holding the rail, trying to keep what was left of his balance. It was the soldier, not Carlos. The man was tall, white, his features Nordic. Jason hugged the wall of the first-floor landing, listening. There was a brief scrape from below. Not deliberate. It wasn't loud or long enough. With a smashed kneecap and a broken wrist, Carlos might well briefly lose his balance, just as Bourne had. Jason edged back to the upper stair and pried the automatic weapon from the dead man's hands and checked the clip. He couldn't get out. The blood would drain out of him before that happened. Jason Bourne had died once on this day. He would die again, but he would take Carlos with him. He crept back to the stairs, digging into his pocket for one of the flares he had bought, uncoiled the fuse and bit through the cord, shortening it to less than an inch. From his other pocket he took a lighter, gripping both in his left hand. Then he angled the machine gun securely into his shoulder and snaked downwards. Silence. Darkness. The library door had been shut. The door beneath him, the only other one in the hall, was also closed. Carlos was making him choose. Behind which door? Or in the hall itself? Bourne braced himself and pulled the trigger, bullets shattering walls and the door beneath him. He slipped his hand under the scalding barrel and put the lighter to the fuse, then squeezed the trigger again. A chandelier crashed to a floor. Ricochets filled the darkness. And then, light. Blinding light as the flare ignited, lighting up trees and walls, hidden paths and mahogany corridors. The stench of death and the jungle was everywhere. The flare in his left hand, gun in his right, Bourne plunged down into the carpeted underbrush, kicking the nearer door open, shattering silver frames and trophies that flew off tables and shelves into the air, into the trees. There was no one. He lurched back into the hall, puncturing the walls with gunfire. No one. The door at the end of the narrow corridor, the room where Cain was born, and would die, but not alone. He shifted the flare to his right hand, reaching into his pocket for the second one, again uncoiled the fuse and bit it off. He shoved the first flare to it, and squinting, losing the battle for balance, approached the door. It was ajar, but Jason instinctively knew something about the door that Carlos didn't. He shoved it open 6 inches and hurled the flares inside. A long burst from a Sten gun echoed as bullets embedded themselves in the lead shield in the door. The firing stopped. A clip expended. Bourne lunged into the room firing. A roar of fury from Carlos accompanied Bourne's realization that the curtains had been drawn, blocking out the sunlight. Then why was there so much light beyond the sizzling flares? It was overpowering, causing explosions in his head, agony at his temples. The screen. The huge screen was pulled down from the ceiling, a white-hot shield of ice-cold fire. He plunged to the protection of a copper bar, rose and jammed the trigger back in another burst. A final burst. The last clip had run out. He hurled the weapon across the room at the figure in white overalls and a white silk scarf that had fallen from his face. The face. He'd seen it before. Where? It struck him that the face was known to many, not just to him. Like so much else, he knew it and did not know it. Bourne spiraled back behind the bar. Gunshots came, 2, 3, the second tearing his left forearm. He pulled his automatic from his belt. He had 3 shots left. One of them had to find its mark. There was a debt to pay and a contract to fulfill. He took the lighter from his pocket and held it beneath a dishcloth suspended from a hook, threw the flaming cloth to his right as he dived left. Carlos fired at the rag as Bourne spun to his knees, leveling his gun, pulling the trigger twice. Carlos buckled, but did not fall. Instead, he crouched, then sprang forward, hands gripping the edge of the huge screen, pulling it downwards with all his weight and strength. It floated over Bourne, blocking everything else from his mind. He screamed as the shimmering silver descended, more frightened of it than of Carlos or of any human being. Images flashed across his eyes, and angry voices shouted in his ears. He fired at the terrible shroud, slashed his hand against it, pushing the cloth away. Then he understood. He had fired his last shot. The assassin loomed above him, his automatic aimed at Jason's head. "Your execution, Delta, on the day scheduled, for everything you've done." Bourne arched, rolling furiously. At least he would die in motion. Gunshots filled the room, hot needles slicing his neck, piercing his legs. He could hear hammering, the smashing of wood and steel, but shapes and sounds were becoming blurred. There was a final deafening crash, followed by men shouting, running, and beyond them the insistent whine of sirens. A tall man in a black overcoat, someone with him, but Jason could not see, and rigid shoulders that floated above a tapered waist, disappearing down the dimly lit corridor. In the chaos, Carlos was escaping. "Carlos!" What emerged from his bleeding throat was a whisper. Bourne tried again, forcing the sound from his stomach. "That's Carlos." Confusion. Commands were shouted, swallowed in consternation. A figure came into focus, a cripple who had tried to kill him in a cemetery outside Paris. "Get away from me!" Bourne lunged back to the fallen screen, his sanctuary, his shroud. "I'll take you all, can't you understand? I'm Delta. Kane is for Charlie and Delta is for Kane. What more do you want from me? I was and I was not. I am and I am not." Somewhere in the distance, sirens reached a crescendo and stopped. Darkness came, and the waves carried Jason up to the night sky, only to hurl him down again into an abyss of watery violence. An explosion filled the sky, a fiery diadem above black waters. And then he heard the words, spoken from the clouds, filling the earth. "Jason, my love, take my hand. Hold it. Tightly, my darling." Peace came with the darkness. Brigadier General Crawford put the folder down on the couch beside him. "I don't need this," he said to Marie Saint-Jacques. "I've gone over and over it, trying to find out where we went wrong." "You presumed where no one should," said the only other person in the hotel suite, Dr. Morris Panoff. "I allowed you to presume, and I'll live with it for the rest of my life." "It's nearly 2 weeks," said Marie impatiently. "I'd like some details. I think I'm entitled to them. Who is he?" "His name's David Webb. He was a career officer, a specialist in Far Eastern affairs until 5 years ago, stationed in Phnom Penh. His wife was a Thai. They had 2 children, a boy and a girl. One Sunday afternoon, while his family were down at their dock, a stray aircraft strafed the area. By the time he reached the river, his wife and children were dead. The plane was never identified. Webb headed for Saigon and trained for Medusa. He became Delta.
Was that when he met Donju?
Asked Marie. Yes. Viet Cong intelligence found out that Webb's younger brother was in Saigon and mounted a trap. They kidnapped Gordon and sent back an informant with word that he was being held in the Tam Quan sector. Delta formed a team who knew the area, including Donju, broke through the trap and found his brother. He also found the double agents. The Vietnamese escaped in the jungle. The white man didn't. Delta executed him on the spot. Jason Bourne. Years later, when Treadstone was formed and Webb called back, Webb took the name.
What was he doing when he was called back for Treadstone?
Asked Marie. Teaching in a small college in New Hampshire. Crawford picked up a folder. Those are the essential facts, Miss Saint-Jacques. Other areas will be covered by Dr. Panoff, who's made it clear that my presence is not required. There is, however, one remaining detail which must be understood. A direct order from the White House.
The protection,
said Marie. Yes. Wherever he goes, regardless of the identity he assumes, he'll be guarded around the clock. He's the only man alive who's ever seen Carlos as Carlos. From what he says, Carlos is a public figure. One day, that identity may come into focus for Webb. Dr. Panoff will confirm that. Marie turned to the psychiatrist.
Is it true, Mo?
It's possible, said Panoff. Crawford left, and Marie poured coffee. Panoff went to the couch where the brigadier had been sitting. It's still warm, he said, smiling. Crawford was sweating right down to his famous backside. He has every right to. They all do.
What's going to happen?
Absolutely nothing until I tell them they can go ahead. And that may not be for months, years for all I know. Not until he's ready.
Not their operation. What's going to happen to him?
Panoff put down his coffee. I'm not sure yet. I've been in on all the conferences, and I've talked to the other shrinks and neurosurgeons. We can go in with a knife and reach the storm centers, reduce the anxieties, bring a kind of peace to him. But it's not the kind of peace he wants. And there's a risk we might wipe away too much. Take away the things he has found, will continue to find. With care, with time. The pattern's been established. There's growth, the pain of recognition and the excitement of discovery. In a way, he's a microcosm of us all. I mean, we're all trying to find out who the hell we are, aren't we? Marie went to the front window in the cottage on the waterfront, with the rising dunes, the fenced-off grounds, and every 50 feet, a man with a gun. She could see him several hundred yards down the beach, skipping shells over the water. The months had been good to him. His body was scarred, but whole, firm again. The nightmares were still there, but he was beginning to cope, to laugh again. Panoff had been right. Images were becoming clearer, meaning found where there had been none before. Something had happened now. He'd thrown himself into the water and was thrashing around, shouting. Then, suddenly, he sprang out, leaping up the beach. By the fence, a guard spun around, his rifle whipped up, a radio pulled from a belt. Marie froze, prepared for the moment they knew might come one day, for the sound of gunfire. He burst through the door, chest heaving, staring at her, his eyes as clear as she'd ever seen them. He spoke softly, but she heard him. My name is David. Marie walked slowly towards him.
Hello, David,
she said.